Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
Chilling tales for dark nights.
Soft White Dam. Written by M.J. Pack. Performance, audio production, and music by Jeff Clement. It's been snowing forever. Every time it seems like it's about to let up, the sky clouds over with that flat, white paper look, and down it comes. More goddamn snow. I stopped shoveling the walk after the first 2 days. My dad was always real particular about his shoveling, so I tried to do the same, but fuck, man. It was useless. I may as well have been that Greek guy with his boulder, the way it piled up after I broke my damn back trying to clear a path. Told myself I'd do the neighborly thing and take care of it as soon as the thaw started, but it hasn't started yet, so seemed like the best idea was just to stay inside and stay warm. Make some soup, drink some whiskey. And after last night, drink more whiskey. Kind of a lot of whiskey. You might think that was the problem, the whiskey, but no. I mean, I was drunk, but a good drunk. The nice, easy drunk that makes your head buzz in the funniest way. I hadn't looked outside in a while. Early on, I'd pulled down one of the blinds to sneak a peek, but saw only more fucking snow. The whole world was white and it was starting to piss me off, so I let the blinds go with a little snapping sound that made me feel better for some reason. Like, yeah, take that, snow. It was getting late, but I wasn't really paying attention at the time. I only knew it was dark out because I hadn't moved from the couch to flip the lights when the gray glow outside finally went down. You couldn't say that the sun set, not really, because it wasn't out all day. It was hidden behind them damn thick snow clouds. And the living room was that weird kind of blue you get when the only source of light is a TV screen. I'd spend most of the day hopping from cable movie to cable movie. Pretty bored, but drunk enough by then that the sight of Goldie Hawn in Overboard wasn't too rough on the eyes. She's an annoying bitch in that one, and she's got a mouth like an insane person, but she's still pretty hot. So I'd settled in with a fresh glass of Jack, pants unzipped in case I felt frisky. And that was when the noises started. Sort of quiet at first. So quiet I thought it was just snow or sleet hitting the windows. Then a little louder. Then, drunk or not, I couldn't ignore it. I was right. It was at the window for sure, but no snow makes a noise like that. After I really heard it for the first time, I waited to see if it was a fluke. But after a second, again. Not fast or nothing, and not random either. Real deliberate. Same sound it makes when you drum your fingers on a table if you're restless. Right on the window pane of my porch window. Someone was screwing with me, I was sure of it. Maybe pissed I hadn't shoveled the walk yet. Out there tapping on my window in the middle of a blizzard just to hawk me off. I waited another minute. I didn't turn down Overboard in case they were listening close. Didn't want them to know I knew they were out there. I was going to catch them off guard, see? And when I heard, I snapped down one of the blinds, ready to make mean eyes at some punk kid or nosy neighbor. Nothing out there, though. Weird, too, because the tapping, it was on the glass right there, right behind those blinds. I half watched the movie for about 10 minutes, waiting for the tapping to start up again, but it didn't. Pretty soon, I drained half the glass of Jack and I was feeling okay again. A little jumpy, I guess, but it hadn't really scared me. Not yet. It was just getting to the part where Goldie really gives it to that snooty teacher when I heard something else. It started quiet again, getting a little louder every minute until I couldn't write off the noise and the storm. This time, I did mute the movie, and almost immediately wished I hadn't. It was this low voice. Couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, but it was low. And it was talking. Only, that's not right, because it wasn't really saying anything. It wasn't saying words. Just sort of gibbering. A constant babble of sounds and wheezy grunts that meant nothing. And it wasn't like another language or anything either. Like, you know when you hear another language, and even though you can't understand them, you know they're saying something. Maybe it's the way they say it, I don't know, but this was different. My dad had a stroke when I was a kid. We were out shopping for a gift for my mom's birthday, and I asked him if he wanted to look at cards. And when he opened his mouth, he started talking, but it wasn't words, it was just garbled stuff. And he knew he wasn't saying the right thing, but he couldn't fix it. I hadn't thought of that in years. But the sounds outside, they were like that. That's the closest I can get. Whatever it was heard me turn down the volume and got louder, gibbering like my dad that day in April. And for a horrible second, I actually thought it was my dad's voice. But he's been dead a long time, so there was no way. And it felt like as soon as I let go of that memory and that thought, the gibbering sounded less like him until I was sure. No, it wasn't my dead dad out there on the porch in the snowstorm. I was drunk, like I said, and for a minute I felt kind of sad about that. My head, it felt kind of funny, too. Like I'd been watching TV in the dark too long. The buzzing that was nice earlier sounded more like hornets than bumblebees now. I finished the glass of whiskey, slammed it on the table, and looked through the blinds again. Nothing out there. Snowing, still, harder than ever. But nothing on the porch, and right away the gibbering stopped. I don't know why I looked like that. I should have been more careful. I didn't know what could be out there, if it was a homeless guy or whatever trying to find a warm place to sleep in the storm, but a part of me also knew it wasn't a homeless guy, and that I should have been more careful when I looked. Because homeless guys don't sound like your dead dad no matter how drunk you are. It was okay, though, because nothing was on the porch. But I didn't unmute overboard, and I was pretty quick to get some more whiskey. A few minutes went by, probably the same as before if I really think about it. And now I heard something running, full on running, back and forth across the porch. Something with big, heavy footsteps and an awful lot of speed. Every third run or so, I'd hear it throw itself against the wooden banisters at either end of the porch. The wood would groan, and whatever it was would let out some weird chuffing sound. Not like it did knock the wind out of itself. More like it was laughing. I didn't know what to do. I was too scared to look now, and really wishing I hadn't had so much to drink. Or maybe that I'd had much, much more. But after the latest slam against the banister, I thought I heard wood splinter, and without thinking I yelled, "Hey! Stop!" It did. It got real quiet. The phone was in the kitchen, I should have called the cops, but it didn't even cross my mind because then...
Danny.
It was the same babbling voice from before, and it made my name sound like gibberish, like my name didn't fit right in its mouth.
Danny.
It wasn't running anymore. It sounded like it was shifting from foot to foot, back and forth, fast, like when a kid gets hyper or has to pee. It was right outside the front door.
Danny. Are you sorry, Danny?
It said, and my stomach suddenly felt like it was full of cold mud.
Are you sorry, Danny? You're sorry, aren't you, Danny? Oh, Danny. Your daddy knows. Oh, yes, Danny. Your daddy's here.
It sounded like my dad again, yeah, but not really. The way a funhouse mirror looks like you, but not really.
Come outside, Danny.
It said,
Daddy's here. Daddy's back. Danny. Open the door. You forgot to shovel the walk, Danny. Daddy's awful mad at you.
I looked down and I was standing at the door, reaching for the knob. I didn't remember even getting off the couch or setting my drink down or zipping my pants back up. I didn't forget to shovel, I told it, stepping slowly away from the door. I'm gonna do it when it stops snowing.
Oh, Danny.
It said,
Don't you know it's never going to stop? Oh, aren't you sorry, Danny? You're going to be so sorry if you don't get out here and see your daddy.
My dad's not out there. I said this more to me than to whatever was on the porch. It felt good, like I was getting a handle on something, so I said it again. My dad's not out there. It's the middle of a damn snowstorm, and he's been dead 15 years, and I don't know what you are, but you're not my dad. The gibbering started again. It stopped saying my name and went back to running back and forth across the porch like it was throwing a tantrum. I don't know why it latched onto my dad. Maybe because he was the first thing I thought of. Maybe because I hadn't thought about him in a long time. Like I said, I don't know, but I listened to the barreling across my porch, babbling, sometimes in my dad's voice, sometimes in the same low voice I heard first. Sometimes something else entirely. It ran back and forth on the porch for almost 4 hours. I never unmuted the TV, just stared at the blinds covering the windows to the porch and finished the bottle of Jack. Finally, the sun came up. I mean, not really. The sky got ivory white and the sun was behind the clouds somewhere, but the important part is it got light out and the thing stopped. I was pretty wasted by then, but I waited another half hour, waited to be sure it was gone and that the morning had really made it go. Remember how I said more whiskey? Kind of a lot of whiskey? Well, I meant it. I'm gonna need a lot more to get through this. Because, well, I checked the weather report today and another winter storm is coming through tonight. Up to 6 more inches by tomorrow morning. And the thing is, I don't know if I'll make it tomorrow morning. That thing is gonna come back. It just is. And this time, I don't know what it's gonna say, but I do know that the first time it came, I almost opened the goddamn door for it. The other reason I started drinking as soon as I woke up this afternoon is what I saw before I finally passed out after my all-nighter with the whatever outside. When I finally did open the door and looked at the porch. The snow is deep, maybe up to my shins if I get really out there and wade in it, but it's not so deep on the porch, since it's covered, you know. But there's enough to leave tracks. And the damnedest thing is, there are tracks, but only hands. No footprints. None at all. Just 100 handprints all over my snow-dusted porch, clear as day. Sorry if this doesn't make much sense. I'm drunk, and it doesn't make much sense to me either. But it's gonna be dark soon, and all I can think about is what's coming back, what speaks in my dad's voice, what walks on its hands in the snow in the night. And you know what? I am sorry. Took 3 days. 3 goddamn days for the snow to stop. But when it did, I packed up all my things and got gone in a hurry. I didn't even shovel the walk before I left. Fuck it. I mean, it wasn't like I had to give notice or anything. Dad's money makes life pretty easy, and I don't need much. Besides, I've got places all over. Feels good to shake the dust off, or in this case, the snow, and stay somewhere else for a while. Especially, after what happened. I decided to head to New Orleans, the Big Easy. There's no place like Bourbon Street in the world, I tell you. So full of life and booze and half-coherent women. My favorite things. Main problem is the rain. There's a reason they don't bury their dead in Louisiana. Stick them in big concrete boxes above the ground instead. But rain isn't snow, and I can survive. I'm good like that. I had a place on the outskirts of town. Close enough I could go into the city and have some fun, but far enough from the constant buzz of NOLA activity that I wouldn't be bothered. I mean, who can listen to jazz that often without going crazy? Jazz is fine and all, but there's a limit. Was okay for a while. Started to suspect that maybe I'd even imagined the whole thing. Tricked myself into thinking there had been something on the porch by way of whiskey and boredom. I mean, I'd been cooped up for days. What do they call that? Cabin fever, right? Yeah, it was probably that, right? Then came the rain. It started as a drizzle. I was heading home from the bar after a fairly successful night, and suddenly it was spitting little droplets onto my windshield. The annoying kind that you barely need wipers for, but if you don't use them, you can't really see. And it honestly pissed me off. This small thing that shouldn't have mattered, but did somehow. It was a black smudge on what had been a pretty good time, and I guess it reminded me of the snow. When I got home, I made sure to latch all the fancy new locks I'd bought for my doors. No use taking chances. By then, it was pouring. I barely fixed myself a glass of Jack. Old habits die hard. When I heard the knock, I froze. It couldn't be. Just like before, I waited, hoping to God or Jesus or all the angels in heaven that I hadn't heard what I knew I had. Enough time passed, rain pounding steady on the roof, that for a brief, blessed moment, I actually thought that, yeah, I had heard something, but it was just the storm and nothing else. Again, a knock. Then another. I knew by now not to look outside, not to check the porch. Last time, that seemed to let it in my head somehow. Let it get me off the couch and almost open the door. Then,
Mister?
it was a little voice. A kid's voice. He sounded all right, sort of familiar, barely audible over the rain. Maybe it was a neighbor. Maybe he sounded like someone I'd heard on TV. All possibilities, sure. Most important, though, he sounded all right. But I still couldn't make myself look out there. "Yeah?" I called, inching towards the door. "Who is it?" Like I said, I'm on the outskirts of town. I pay attention real close to my neighbors. I didn't remember seeing a kid.
Mister? Let me in.
The kid said, his voice shaking like it does when you're trying not to cry, but pretty close to failing.
I was with my dad, and he left me in the car, and I don't know where he is. It's been real long. I'm getting so worried.
For a second, my heart went out to the kid. It really did. My dad did something similar like that to me too once, when I was real little. Then I realized. "How long's he been gone?" I asked. My voice wasn't shaking, but I sort of was.
Almost 2 hours.
The kid said miserably.
He parked outside of some house. I don't know who lives there. He told me to be a good boy and wait.
Of course he did. I remembered that much. But, like my dad, I hadn't thought about it in a long time. Suddenly, wildly, the doorknob began to rattle.
Please let me in.
The kid pleaded.
It's cold and wet out here, and I'm soaked, and I don't know where my dad is.
"You didn't wait," I said, the glass of Jack sweating in the hot palm of my hand. "You got out, and that's real bad, kid. He told you to be a good boy and wait." A long, tense pause while the doorknob kept rattling.
I suppose.
the kid said, sort of thoughtfully.
Daddy might be awful mad if he finds out I didn't stay in the car, huh?
Yeah. I exhaled, took a big swig of whiskey, swallowed. It was like swallowing cold metal. He was. The doorknob stopped moving. I suddenly knew why the kid had sounded familiar. It wasn't a neighbor. It wasn't someone I'd heard on TV. It was me.
Penny,
He said slowly, drawing the last sound out long and low. I told you my dad was real particular about things, like shoveling the walk when it snowed. He was also real particular about rules and obeying them. We waited as long as we could, I said, like talking to this other me outside the door was normal, fine, not batshit crazy. We waited, kid. I know that. But it was such a long time.
Daddy got mad, didn't he, Danny?
It was still my voice. The voice of me when I was 8 and my dad left me in the car. And that was somehow worse. The funhouse mirror version in the snow had been better because I could tell myself that there was something wrong, something bad. But this just sounded like me. Yeah, he sure did, I said. But he told us, he told us to be good, and what did we do? Got right out of the car and started snooping like spoiled little shits. Another swig. We deserved what we got.
Are you sorry, Danny?
He said.
Are you sorry for what you did, Danny? You didn't get what's coming to you. Aren't you sorry?
I remember the whooping I got when we got home that night. I had gotten what was coming all right. Outside, the rain poured. No, we got punished. I already sort of resigned myself that this was happening. There was no getting away from it, so I sat down on the couch closest to the door and swallowed half the glass. Don't you remember? We got it good. Could barely sit down for a week. He'd used the belt that time. The part with the buckle.
Danny.
Slow, deliberate slaps against the door, like palms smacking on wood.
Let me in. Let me in. Let me in.
I exhaled through my nose. The world was starting to dim around the edges, but I tried to ground myself. Took another sip, hoping it would warm my insides, which had become cold, sick. I didn't answer.
Danny. If you don't let me in, he'll get me. He'll get us.
I didn't answer.
Aren't you sorry?
It shrieked, and then it was like there were 1,000 hands all at once, slapping the wood, the frame, the windows. Oh God, the windows. I thought to put locks on the doors, but not the goddamn windows. I dropped the glass, grabbed my car keys, and went for the back like a bat out of hell. I'd left something important in the basement, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered except getting away from that fucking thing. The screen door stuck at first when I tried to open it. Nearly went barreling through the metal mesh. The stupid handle caught. It catches sometimes, and it caught then. And behind me, I heard one of the front windows open so hard the glass shattered. I slammed against the door with my shoulder and the handle caught again and broke. I fell through and started to run. My car was parked in a shed behind the house. It's more private that way. I like my privacy, just like my dad. With unsteady hands, I wrenched the shed doors open, boots slipping in the mud. I was already drenched. I made my way to the car when I heard it. Quick, thick, squelching sounds. Something was behind me. It was moving fast. I threw myself into the car and jabbed the keys blindly into the ignition. Something must have been looking out for me, because I got it the first time, lurched the car into gear, and drove straight through the back wall of the shed. Splintered wood went flying everywhere. The car fishtailed, its tires finding little traction in the mud. But soon I was off the grass and on the little gravel road that wound around my property. It led, eventually, to the highway, and that's how I got to the hotel, where I'll be staying for a while. I don't know who's listening. I don't know who cares. But if you are, if you do you need me to tell you that when I went back, in the daylight, of course, the front of my house was covered in filthy, muddy handprints? Of course not. What I didn't expect, I guess, is for them to be so low to the ground, like it couldn't reach too high, like a kid couldn't. I don't know where I'm going next. It comes in the snow. It comes in the rain. It keeps coming back. But like I said, I've got places all over. And what it doesn't know about me is how well I can survive. I survived my dad, you know. I can survive this.
Every Leaf is a Flower. Written by M.J. Pack. Performance, audio production, and music by Jeff Clement. I managed to make it a few more months. Got to a new place, set up shop, went back to New Orleans for just a day trip to clear out my business in the basement. No one had messed with it. That was good. That's why I picked such a remote place in the first place. Me and my dad, we liked our privacy. You probably know that by now. I went north this time, followed the ocean along the east and tried to find somewhere safe. Somewhere dry, somewhere that no one could leave handprints. That's what was following me, right? The handprints, the voice. Worse, what was attached to those handprints. It was always different, but it was always the same. My father, something else. My childhood, something else. Shifting, changing, unpredictable and terrifying. I wanted to tell someone about it, but who was there to tell? Ma was in the ground 5 years now. My dad, a lot longer than that. What they don't tell you about growing up is how alone you end up feeling. I hunkered down in my place in the north, waited, because I knew it was coming. It had to be coming, right? The quiet was starting to get to me. It was worse somehow that I knew it was coming and I knew it wouldn't stop, but didn't know when or how. It got so goddamn close last time, you know? That other me. The thing that sounded like myself as a kid. Like myself at age 8 when my dad had left me in the car parked outside some strange house for hours. Hadn't thought about that in a real long time. Not until other me jogged some memories. I started to think about it, though, while I waited. About how it took so long for my dad to come back. He'd told me to wait, but I couldn't. I had to pee, and I was worried, so I figured getting out of the car for just a minute wouldn't hurt. Right? I mean, sure, my dad was strict, but how could you expect a little kid to wait that long by himself? After a while, summer faded into fall, and it still hadn't shown up. Was it because we had a mild season? No snow, no rain, no crazy weather to bring it on? I hoped so. But when I started seeing that thin sheen of frost on my porch early in the morning, I decided it might be best to fix my sleep schedule. Like, no more late-night drinks, keep the whiskey to the daytime and fall into bed by 6 p.m. before nightfall. My dad did that, you know, after he got off the third shift for a few years. He said it did him good. Main thing is, I didn't want to hear what could be outside. It only came at night, and I was so tired of waiting, you know? I thought it might be best to just shut myself off during the times it could come, because either it couldn't, or wouldn't, get inside without my help. Or, if it did, maybe I'd just go peacefully, in my sleep. That was a nice thought. Then, once I started getting more sleep, I didn't just think about that night outside the strange house. I started to dream about it. In the dreams, I'm little again. Or maybe I'm not. I feel short, but when I look at my hands, they're man's hands, leathery and tough. Maybe they were my dad's hands, I don't know. I use these hands to knock on the door. I have that tight, tense sensation in my bladder, the pinching need to pee. I cross my legs back and forth, hoping someone will come to the door, but they never do. So I go to a window. When I look inside, I see my dad. He's with a woman. It's not my mom. And he sees me too, and he's real mad. He yells, "Danny!" Then I wake up. The same dream, over and over. The same way, every time. In the car, have to pee, knock on the door, go to the window. Dad with a woman. "Danny!" And see, here's the weird thing. I only have this dream in the daytime. Never had it at night. Well, I guess maybe that's not the weirdest thing. No handprints yet or anything. Nothing like that. But since the leaves have started to change, since they've gotten all colorful, red and orange and yellow, they've started showing up in my house. First, they were on the porch, but that's pretty normal, right? Gust of wind blows them up there, no cause for concern. But then one day, You wake up just after dawn, like usual, happy to see the sun coming up over the horizon, and you see a trail of them from your front door to the dining room. And they're pretty at first, see? They're those brilliant fall shades, but they still have enough springy life in them to stay in one piece. At first, you sort of like them. Then, as the season goes on, as you have the same dream over and over again about your dad and the woman and your big man hands, they start to die. They get crunchy and crumbly, and you start to find them everywhere. Trailing through the house, stuffed in your dresser drawers, folded into quarters and stuck neatly between the bills in your wallet. It's deliberate. It's a message. It's what it does when it can't leave handprints. One morning you wake up coughing, sputtering, tongue drier than you can ever remember. You spit and spit, and wouldn't you know, you're spitting out a mouthful of brittle autumn leaves. Something has come into your house in the middle of the night and stuffed your fucking mouth with leaves. God only knows what would have happened if you'd been awake when it came. Then you wonder, is it really your dad you're hearing in the dreams? Is it really your dad yelling your name? Or is it something else? Something crouched by your bed as it parts your lips and begins shoving dead leaves inside. And this, this is what makes you realize you can't get away from it. You can't keep running. You could try, of course. You could keep sleeping through its cycle, or moving with the weather, or whatever. But one day you'll choke to death on whatever else it's decided to shove in your mouth. And maybe next time, it won't be as harmless as leaves. So I pack up and go to the last place you saw your dad alive. The last place you have really good, happy memories. And you leave the leaves behind. The Earth, the Air, and You. Written by M.J. Pack. Performed by Jeff Clement. Featuring Nikolle Doolin. Audio production and music by Jeff Clement. I went back to Arizona, to my dad's old place. Like I said, I've got places all over, but most of them are mine. This one was my dad's. This one was my favorite. It took a few days to get my sleep schedule back on track, to get ready, because after the snow, the mud, the leaves, I knew there was no escaping it. Best I could do was go back to the only place I considered home. My dad bought the place, a modest little bungalow plopped out in the middle of the desert. Remote, private, you bet, after Ma filed for divorce. She found out what he'd been up to, and finally found herself a spine. I don't think my dad much cared, to be honest. He didn't fight her, didn't screw her out of what she asked for either. Gave her a fair amount of money, and jetted down to sunny Arizona. Almost like he was relieved. I spent my teenage years bouncing back and forth between Ma's place and my dad's. It wasn't so bad. When I wasn't in school, my dad let me drink with him. He'd be in his armchair, the same bulky armchair that sits in my living room now, like a dozing brown bear. Nothing wrong with a little Jack Daniels between men, he'd say. What he didn't say was that even though I saw what he was doing in that strange house, I never told Ma, even though he belted me good when we got home that night. I think that made him respect me. I didn't ask questions either when he left for long periods of time. My dad had always been private, and even though I was older, I had no doubt I'd get the belt again if I went snooping. When he got drunk, he could get mean, and sometimes he'd come back stinking plastered looking for a chore to keep him busy. No snow in Arizona, no walk to shovel, so every now and then I'd hear him out in the backyard, digging. He was the kind of man who had to keep his hands busy. Couldn't fault him for that, I guess. Once I was back to normal, feeling like maybe I could stay up pretty late, I bought myself a bottle of Jack and settled in the living room, sank into my dad's old armchair. I turned on the television and began flipping channels. Sadly enough, I couldn't find Overboard on anywhere. I drank my whiskey. Kind of a lot of whiskey. And sure enough, after about an hour, it started. I switched off the television, finished my drink, poured another one. "I hear you out there," I called. "Didn't take you too long this time, did it?" "What's it gonna be, huh?" I demanded. Jack had made me brave, braver than before, so I slammed another swig back and felt the warmth spread through my stomach. "Are you my dad? Are you me? Gonna yell at me for not shoveling the walk?" "No snow out there, asshole. And no rain, neither. We don't get any rain in these parts. Not that often. Just sand and sun." On one window, the one on the porch. Then I heard it in the kitchen, too. And towards the back of the house, in the mudroom. Tapping on all the windows. There were more this time. And when it spoke, that's when I knew I'd made a mistake. That I'd missed the whole goddamn point. That I was absolutely, utterly fucked. Not my dad, not me, not even the wordless babbling. Worse. Much, much worse.
"Danny. Oh, Danny. Danny."
It said in a sweet, feminine voice. A voice I didn't really recognize, but also sort of did.
"Danny. Oh, Danny. We're out here, Danny. We're here. You thought we couldn't find you, but we did."
No. There was no way. I'd made sure. I'd been so careful.
Danny. Oh, Danny. Danny.
It crooned again, and there was nothing wrong with the voice, really. Just sounded like a normal lady. Someone I might meet on one of my nights out. Someone I almost certainly did.
Danny. Oh, Danny. You thought we couldn't get to you, but we did. We're here. Come outside. Say hello. Oh, Danny, don't you like us anymore? You liked us so much. Too much, didn't you?
I felt like my mouth had been stuffed full of leaves again. My stomach wasn't warm anymore. It lurched like I'd swallowed a gallon of cold, thick mud.
Danny. Oh, Danny. You just did what your daddy taught you. We're not angry, Danny. We're not mad. Those were our friends we sent before. We couldn't get to you first, so we sent them along. And they were the old ones. They were the angry ones. But we're fresh and new, and we want to know why you left us, Danny.
I gripped the glass of whiskey so tight I thought it might shatter. You can't be out there, I said, when I could move my tongue again. None of you. I made sure you couldn't walk. I made sure. They shouldn't have been able to get out of the basement. I learned that. I learned from my dad. If you let them stay mobile, they can almost get away. That lady in the house that night almost got away because I distracted him at the window. She bolted, but my dad was faster, and he took her down. But I'm not that fast, so it was always just easier to cut off their feet.
Danny. Oh, Danny. We figured it out. We're smart girls, Danny. Did you know if you try hard enough, you can walk on your hands?
It sounded so nice, like it wasn't mad at all. Not like the others. But oh God, I wasn't sure it was telling the truth.
It took us longer. The lot of us. Oh, Danny, it took us a while to try hard enough, but we did. We can do it now, just like our friends. Our angry friends. Oh, Danny, did you know when you're angry you try much harder?
Yeah, that I knew. When you think your dad is the best guy in the world, but really he's just a bully. He thinks he's so much better than you and hits you with the buckle end of his belt for just being a kid, when it was him who was being bad. Him who was in there strangling some woman who probably was going to tell Ma about what they'd been up to. When he punishes you again and again for doing things you didn't mean to do, like forgetting to shovel the walk, for getting mud on the porch, for not getting all the leaves in the yard bagged just right. Yeah, you get angry, and you try much harder to be better than him. I think he only did the one, I mused, finally lifting the glass to my lips with a trembling hand. I think it was just the one, if I had to guess.
Oh, Danny.
It said, and it sounded aroused, like it was getting hot or something.
Danny. Oh, Danny. You did so much more, didn't you?
At all the windows. How were they tapping? If they walked on their hands, how were they tapping? Oh God, as if any of this made any sense at all. How many of them were out there? Some of them? Dear God. All of them?
You left me in the basement, Danny.
It said, sad now, pouty, a girlfriend who's not getting her way.
You came back, oh, Danny, yes, you did. But I was so smelly by then. And when you left, I hadn't even gone yet. I was still there. Still alive. And my feet. Oh, Danny, why did you cut off my feet? It hurt, Danny. Oh, Danny, you hurt me so. You hurt us so.
Unbelievably, I heard more tapping. But this tapping was rain. It was fucking raining. Again. You were all so easy, I said, wiping a thin sheen of sweat from my upper lip with the back of my hand. Buy you a few drinks, bring you home, knock you out. Maybe if it hadn't been so easy.
Oh, Danny, don't lie. Don't be a little liar. You did it to show your daddy, didn't you? And you showed your daddy. Oh, Danny, we know that now. We know what you did. Your daddy is awful mad at you for what you did.
The rain fell harder, like a fucking monsoon. I couldn't hear the tapping on the windows anymore, but I knew they were out there. All of them. Because why not all of them? On the porch, something began running back and forth. Back and forth. I thought I heard a little kid laugh, but couldn't be sure. I felt like I was losing my mind. Thoughts were slippery and escaping from me. They were all out there.
Are you sitting in his chair, Danny?
It said, louder now to be heard over the downpour.
Oh, Danny, are you sitting in the chair where you did it? He told us about it, Danny. He's awful mad at you. Oh, Danny. Oh, Danny.
I had to wait till I got big enough, I murmured. Strong enough. I had to do it with my own hands. Just like he did.
Danny. Oh, Danny. You wrapped your big, strong hands around his neck. And you showed your daddy, didn't you? 15 years ago. Oh, Danny. Oh, yes, Danny. That's what you did. We know what you did. Your daddy wants you to get what's coming to you. And now it's raining. And now we're done talking. And now we are coming inside. And now you're going to be so sorry.
The front door burst open. I heard windows in other rooms, all the windows shattering. And there they were. The blonde I'd brought home in Texas. The redhead with the huge tits I scored in Minnesota. The mousy little brunette I'd settled for in New Orleans. The one I'd left in the basement when the whatever on the porch came through the window. Scores of them. All of them. Had there really been that many? Crawling through the broken glass, unaware of the way their rotting skin was being shredded to ribbons. A few were dragging themselves forward by their elbows, trailing bloody stumps where their feet had once been. Most, though, were walking on their hands. And god damn were they fast. They must have been angrier than they let on. I dropped my drink and scrambled to the back of the house, to the kitchen where the phone was. I tried to handle this myself and it was out of my hands. I had to get help. I had to get someone out here to help. Oh God, why had I moved to this godforsaken place in the middle of nowhere? Outside, the rain poured, buckets of it. When I got to the kitchen, I fumbled with the phone on the cradle, nearly dropping it in my panic. And I looked behind me. They had me surrounded. My house stunk of decaying flesh. Some of the older ones, their jaws hung crookedly from their skulls. But they were just waiting. The ones on their elbows were crouched, tense, ready to pounce. The ones on their hands swayed in an eerie, expert balance. Slowly, unaware if they could see me now that I was still. Many of them had no eyes, after all, just gaping dark holes in their heads. I punched 911. I brought the phone to my ear. As the dead women watched, I told the operator that I was being attacked and needed help. They said help was on the way. I wondered if it would be soon enough, and replaced the phone on the hook. The brunette, the mousy one from New Orleans, shifted back and forth on her hands, like an excited little kid.
Danny. Oh, Danny. You're going to be so sorry.
She squealed through decaying lips. I wasn't even sure how she could make sounds with those lips. A tittering spread through the crowd, a slurpy sort of giggling that almost couldn't be heard over the heavy rain.
No.
The women said in droning unison.
No. Stop. Shut up. Leave me alone. Stop.
I put my hands over my ears.
Stop! Leave me alone!
I screamed.
You were stupid sluts! You were just like the one my dad did. You got what was coming to you.
Oh, Danny.
The brunette cried as the rest of them kept saying my name.
Oh, Danny. You showed your daddy. You showed us. And now you're going to be so sorry. Now you're going to see your daddy again. You'll be like us. You'll get what's coming to you. Yes, you will. Oh,
Dad.
They said my name over and over. It began to sound like a song. I rocked back and forth, shouting nonsense at them, trying to drown out the rain and the chorus of dead women crooning my name. I backed up against the sink, hands clamped over my ears. I don't know how long I was like that, but they got louder, 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 until... Ha! I cried out, triumphant, and opened my eyes to look at the 37 rotting bodies that filled the house where I'd murdered my father.
You hear that, you dumb bitches? That's the police. They're coming. They're gonna save me.
Indeed, the women had stopped singing, and through the rain I heard the distinctive wail of a cop car's siren. But they were smiling.
Oh, Danny.
Sighed the brunette from New Orleans.
Look in the backyard.
My blood ran cold. No. There was no way. I turned and looked out the window that oversaw the backyard. The backyard of dry, packed desert dirt. The backyard where my dad used to dig, and where I eventually did my own digging too. He liked Arizona because it was dry, because it never rained. But tonight, oh, how it had rained. And it turns out, I was wrong. He'd done more than one. Just like me. In the backyard, the tightly packed desert dirt was mostly gone. Under the downpour, it had become a thin, murky soup. In it floated swollen, bloated carcasses. Bones stripped of flesh. A few heads that still had wispy hair on them, even as the skull gleamed beneath it. I knew they weren't all mine. Not that many bones. But that didn't much matter. The siren was louder now, right outside. It didn't take long for me to put the pieces together. They would see the bodies. They would check my other places. They would find out what I'd done with my big, strong hands. All because I couldn't wait in the car. I turned back to the living room and was unsurprised to find it empty. No rotting women. Those were in the backyard. The interior of my house suddenly began to flash blue, red, blue, red, and I began to laugh. What is it they say about the sins of the father? It doesn't much matter. Because I lied. I'm not sorry.
I'm currently seated at a computer terminal in a little white, sterile room. There's about a half dozen other computer terminals here, all facing the same way, like a classroom. There's posters on the wall with medical information. Everyone in them looks happy and complacent. Zombies. This place is called Sleep Health Centers, just outside of Boston. It's a clinic for people with sleeping disorders. I'm feeling a little loopy from the azoplicone, so if my speech gets all slurred, you'll just have to deal with it. The docs want me to do some recording and try to verbalize my thoughts. He said that the process can help with insomnia. And I gotta admit, if things were normal, I'd probably be passed out right now. But things ain't normal. Nah. It's not that I can't sleep. It's that I don't want to sleep. I actually doze off pretty frequently, but when I realize I'm falling asleep, I catch myself, snap myself out of it. When I don't, I drift off and I can't stop myself. I dream. And that's what I want to avoid. If I could control what I dream about, I'd sleep right now and I'd probably not wake up for months. But I can't control it. Ever since this past spring. Ever since Tom. That house on Black Pond Road. Just thinking about it makes my skin crawl. Writing that makes me see it all again in my head. I don't want to relive it, but Dr. Kirsch, he's my doc. Nice guy, smiles a lot. Practically whispers when he talks. Dr. Kirsch said that if maybe I write about my experience, it might release me from it, as he puts it. Like there's some sort of mental hold on me, torturing me. Guilt? I was as much a victim as Tom was. Tom. Tom was my friend from college. We both attended Boston University. Freshman year, his room was right across the hall from mine. I remember running into him on a bench late one night while my roommate was spending too long talking on the phone to his girlfriend back home. Tom bummed me a smoke and we just sat, talked about our roommates, idiosyncrasies. Couple hours. After that, we just hung out all the time. Even after college, we stuck together. Both got jobs in the city. Lived near each other in Somerville. When was that? It was May, right? Friday the 13th. Of all days. And Tom called me up after work. I remember the conversation like it was yesterday.
What do you got going on this weekend?
Nothing.
Any chance you could help me clean out a house?
Who are we robbing?
My dead aunt.
Friends help you move, good friends help you move bodies, eh?
Unfortunately, somebody already moved the body, but she's got a lot of other stuff in her place, and I need to clean it out so it can get sold.
Tom picked me up that night. We drove and listened to tunes on the radio, stopped and ate, chilled, just drove and drove. And as we were going, I posed the question, "So, Tom, how'd she die?"
She hung herself.
Well, I'm sorry for your loss.
Don't be, she was absolutely insane.
I'm sure she loved you too.
Hardly. But she loved her brother, and he just happened to be my father. He needs to get the house sold, but my parents live out in Washington now, so I agreed to clean the house.
What a good son you are.
Well, I'm getting paid for it.
Oh, I see. I help do the work and you get all the reward.
You get the reward of my company for a weekend. In some rat hole.
I guess that's better than what I had planned. Black Pond Road. It's a hell of a name for a place. Her house looked like it was going to collapse. There was one floor, one large living room connected to a tiny kitchen and two tiny bedrooms. The bathroom was practically a closet. There was a screened porch off the side looking into the woods. It was about after 1 in the morning when we got there. I remember suggesting we sleep in the car, just in case the house collapsed. Tom pulled out a flashlight. We gathered our bedrolls and backpacks and went inside. Then the floor moved. It was dark, but when Tom shone his light in, I swear to Christ, it looked for a moment like the floor moved. I'll never forget that floor. It was the kitchen. Greasy, stained white tiles. Everything in that room was greasy and stained, even the windows. They were so gross. The reflected light from Tom's flashlight, it came back like a mustardy puke yellow. Was it clicking? Tapping?
I can't describe it, but the feeling when we walked in was like a couple crashes walking into a chatty party and everyone stopping what they were saying and just looking at us. Almost the faintest echo of a final sound, like 100 fingernails tapping on a tabletop, and then quiet. Did you hear that?
Nah.
We should have slept in the car. My room was like a prison cell attached to the living room. Tom's room was only accessible from the screened porch. I took a look in and told him we should switch. Hey, if I'm not getting paid, at least give me the nicer room.
You don't want this room. This is the room she hung herself in.
Well, after that, we just stood there for a bit. The only thing missing from my room are bars on the window.
That's so you can escape when a ghost comes for us.
Damn, Tom, a ghost wouldn't be caught dead here. I went and unrolled my sleeping bag in the tiny bed in my room and then climbed in and lay there in the dark. After a while, everything being quiet, I started hearing this sound. It was like chittering and buzzing. Mosquitoes, that's what I thought. I pulled the sleeping bag over my head and tucked it under me to keep anything out. Oh, God. If I hadn't been so tired. Something bit me on the web of skin between my fingers. I woke up and was instantly in pain all over my legs, like 100 needle pricks. And my feet felt like I was standing in the sand at the beach when the water coming in and the mud squishing between my toes. I jerked out of the sleeping bag and fell on the floor. I hurt my chin on something. I don't know what. I got up and checked my hand. It was a tiny red dot of a bug bite between my index and middle finger. And then I looked at my legs. They were dotted like a bad case of chickenpox. Hundreds of little bite marks. And I looked at my sleeping bag. It was a stream of bugs, just skittering out of the bag, crawling over each other. Earwigs, hundreds and hundreds of earwigs, slithering out of the bag I'd been sleeping in. House centipedes with them, wiggling along. This tide of glistening bodies, just crawling out of the bag with me. I felt like I was going to puke. I ran from the room, slamming the door shut. When the morning arrived, I went out through the porch and into Tom's room and shook him. Get out. You gotta get out of your bag.
Dude, what time is it?
It's morning time and you need to get out of the sleeping bag, dude. My bag is full of bugs. I'm covered in bug bites. Get the hell out of the bag.
Oh, my stomach hurts. Just give me a second.
Tom didn't have any bugs in his bag. I almost hated him for that. But then he complained again about his stomach hurting and pulled up his shirt. I saw these swollen marks all along the waistline of his pants.
What the hell, dude?
We are not sleeping in this house, man. Look at my legs. My bites weren't swollen, but they itched so bad. I wasn't taking my bedroll home. No way in hell was I keeping it after seeing all those bugs crawl out of it. Burn it. Just burn the whole house. Burn it. And that's my dream. When I fall asleep, I'm back in that bag, only I can't get out. And the earwigs and the centipedes are covering my feet and my legs, and crawling up into my underwear, and all over my chest, and then they're on my neck, and on my arms. in my ears and wiggling towards my nose, and I can't scream because they'll be in my mouth. And no matter how much I thrash, the bag won't open, and they just keep crawling back over me. I can't dream that anymore. I spent a week telling myself it was just a dream, but I know they didn't crawl over me. They had to have been all over me as they slithered into the warm, dark comfort of my bag. Maybe I wouldn't dream it if Tom hadn't. I'm getting off track. We didn't find any bugs in Tom's room. He gave me his car keys, and I went into town and bought some cortisone for him to put on the bites. When I got back, Tom was outside. He had this flashlight, and he was looking under the porch.
Come here.
So I went over. I looked under the porch at what he was pointing at. The porch was raised on these concrete blocks because of the tilt of the ground. We could see all the way under the house. On the far side, there was this gray muck. It looked like crusted, packed mud.
That's a hive.
I remember it felt like I just hit the peak on a roller coaster and now the world was flying down at me. It's huge. There's no way I can do the enormity of this thing justice. It was spread across the underside of the house from the edge of the base on deep into the darkness. Nothing was moving on it, but I looked at it a long time. I could see little passage holes in it. Hundreds and hundreds of holes.
We are leaving.
I was ahead of Tom. I wanted to be home already. I waited while Tom used the cream I'd bought on his bites, which I knew now was stings. It was unnatural. I swear, the aggressiveness of the insect life in that house. I ended up driving us back. Tom got these awful cramps. He eventually had to lie down in the back seat, doubled over in pain. I pulled over at a rest stop and made him let me check the spots out. His swelling had gone down, but he had these stabbing pains in his gut. I told him we needed to take him to the doctor. I wanted to see one myself. I had these bites all over my legs. You've got to tell your parents to burn that house to the ground.
Oh, believe me, I will.
I went and had the bites checked on Sunday. It was fine. I had my first nightmare that night. In it, I was back in that bag. I was being consumed by earwigs and centipedes. I called Tom to see if he'd gotten checked. He didn't answer. I called him again on Monday. When I talked to him, he sounded, I don't know, distant maybe. Like he was thinking about something else. I asked him if he'd told his folks about the house. He said he hadn't. I took the day off and I went to see him on Wednesday. I buzzed him, but he didn't answer. I got into the building when someone else came out and I found this door was unlocked. He was sitting on his couch, just staring at the far wall. He looked gray. His skin, it wasn't pale or rotting or anything like that, but he did not look healthy. He hadn't cleaned up in a couple days and his place stunk. He just sat there. Tom, we gotta get you to a doctor, dude.
I'm fine now. Thanks.
He still sounded distant. I don't think he even saw me. You're not fine, dude. This isn't fine. I'm getting you some clothes and we're going to the hospital. Oh, God, I let him out of my sight. Oh, God, this is my fault. Oh, God. I'm so sorry, Tom. Tom, I'm so sorry. When I came back, he was gone. And his door was open. I went outside and I looked for him, but he wasn't anywhere. I waited for hours in the step of his building when I finally went home. I went back after work on Thursday, but his door was shut and locked. I buzzed him, but I got no answer. I called his cell and was directed straight to voicemail. I didn't know what to do. I was just struggling to think. I've been having this nightmare for days and hadn't started refusing to sleep. I just couldn't think straight. I should have called the police. When I got home, I just fell asleep on the couch. And I dreamed of being trapped in that bag again. I swear, when I woke up, I felt like the bites on my legs had returned. Friday arrived. It was a week after that awful day, when I was just a zombie the whole day. My supervisor just told me to go home. I was so tired that I missed the stop for Davis Square and found myself wandering out of Alewife, not even thinking about where I was going. The walk helped me think, though, and when I got home, I called Tom's folks and spoke to his father. I told him Tom was sick, and I was very worried about him. He told me that he had spoken to him recently, and had confirmed some of my suspicions.
Tom did sound odd when he called last night.
When he called, did he tell you about the house?
Well, yes, but I assumed it was a joke.
No, sir. You need to have that place raised.
Raised? No. He didn't say anything about that. He joked about going to live there.
I honestly don't think it was Tom he spoke to. I don't think he was in control at that point. And whatever was in control intended to take him back to the house. To live there. Poor Tom. I went back to his place that afternoon and got in again. His door was unlocked, but he wasn't there. He had left a note on his fridge. You could tell something was messed up. It was so hard to read. It said,
I can feel them moving inside me. I can't stop it. I don't want to go. Bye.
Tom shot himself that weekend. They found his body in Cambridge with a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. Just another body in an alley with a hole in his head. I didn't even know he owned a gun. The police didn't suspect foul play, but they did an autopsy because he looked like he'd been on drugs. When I called his folks to offer my condolences, I asked them if they'd found drugs. They told me that the coroner had found dozens of large wasp larvae living inside of him. Oh, God. They had been feeding on him from the inside, burrowing through his body. I told his parents to burn that house to the ground and salt the earth once the ashes were cold. I don't know what they did about it. It may still be there, buzzing and chittering of life. And the floor moved. The house took Tom's life. The bugs. And I can't sleep. I'm trapped in a bag. And they're getting in my mouth. And my nose. And my ears. And they're moving across my skin. And they're consuming me. I don't feel better. I just want to forget. How do I end this thing? I can't stand this room anymore.
From even the greatest of horrors, irony is seldom absent. Sometimes it enters directly into the composition of the events, while sometimes it relates only to their fortuitous position among persons and places. The latter sort is splendidly exemplified by a case in the ancient city of Providence, where in the late 40s, Edgar Allan Poe used to sojourn often during his unsuccessful wooing of the gifted poetess, Mrs. Whitman. Poe generally stopped at the mansion house in Benefit Street, the renamed Golden Ball Inn, whose roof has sheltered Washington, Jefferson, and Lafayette, and his favorite walk led northward along the same street to Mrs. Whitman's home and the neighboring hillside churchyard of St. John's, whose hidden expanse of 18th-century gravestones had for him a peculiar fascination. Now, this irony is this. In this walk, so many times repeated, the world's greatest master of the terrible and the bizarre was so obliged to pass a particular house on the eastern side of the street, a dingy, antiquated structure perched on the abruptly rising side hill, with a great unkempt yard dating from a time when the region was partly open country. It does not appear that he ever wrote or spoke of it, nor is there any evidence that he even noticed it. And yet that house, to the two persons in possession of certain information, equals or outranks in horror the wildest fantasy of the genius who so often passed it unknowingly, and stands starkly leering as a symbol of all that is unutterably hideous. The house was, and for that matter still is, of a kind to attract the attention of the curious. Originally a farm or semi-farm building, it followed the average New England colonial lines of the middle 18th century, the prosperous peak-roofed sort, with 2 stories and a dormerless attic, and with a Georgian doorway and interior paneling dictated by the progress of taste at the time. It faced south, with one gable end buried to the lower windows in the eastward rising hill, and the other exposed to the foundations toward the street. Its construction, over a century and a half ago, had followed the grading and straightening of the road in that especial vicinity, for Benefit Street, at first called Back Street, was laid out as a lane winding amongst the graveyards of the first settlers, and straightened only when the removal of the bodies to the north burial ground made it decently possible to cut through the old family plots. At the start, the western wall had lain some 20 feet up a precipitous lawn from the roadway, but a widening of the street at about the time of the Revolution sheared off most of the intervening space, exposing the foundation so that a brick basement wall had to be made, giving the deep cellar a street frontage with door and 2 windows above ground, close to the new line of public travel. When the sidewalk was laid out a century ago, the last of the intervening space was removed, and Poe in his walks must have seen only a sheer ascent of dull gray brick flush with the sidewalk and surmounted at a height of 10 feet by the antique shingled bulk of the house proper. The farm-like grounds extended back very deeply up the hill, almost to Wheaton Street. The space south of the house, abutting on Benefit Street, was of course greatly above the existing sidewalk level, forming a terrace bounded by a high bank wall of damp, mossy stone, pierced by a steep flight of narrow steps which led inward between canyon-like surfaces to the upper regions of mangy lawn, roomy brick walls, and neglected gardens whose dismantled cement urns, rusted kettles fallen from tripods of knotty sticks, and similar paraphernalia set off the weather-beaten front door from its broken fanlight, rotting Ionic pilasters, and wormy triangular pediment. What I heard in my youth about the Shunned house was merely that people died there in alarmingly great numbers. That, I was told, was why the original owners had moved out some 20 years after building the place. It was plainly unhealthy, perhaps because of the dampness and fungus growth in the cellar, the general sickish smell, the drafts of the hallways, or the quality of the well and pump water. These things were bad enough, and these were all that gained belief among the persons whom I knew. Only the notebooks of my antiquarian uncle, Dr. Elihu Whipple, revealed to me at length the darker, vaguer surmises which formed an undercurrent of folklore among old-time servants and humble folk, surmises which never traveled far and which were largely forgotten when Providence grew to be a metropolis with a shifting modern population. The general fact is that the house was never regarded by the solid part of the community as, in any real sense, haunted. There were no widespread tales of rattling chains, cold currents of air, extinguished lights, or faces at the window. Extremists sometimes said the house was unlucky, but that is as far as they went. What was really beyond dispute is that a frightful proportion of persons died there, or more accurately, had died there, since after some peculiar happenings over 60 years ago, the building had become deserted through the sheer impossibility of renting it. These persons were not all cut off suddenly by one cause. Rather did it seem that their vitality was insidiously sapped, so that each one died the sooner from whatever tendency to weakness he may have naturally had. And those who did not die displayed in varying degree a type of anemia or consumption, and sometimes a decline of the mental faculties, which spoke ill for the salubriousness of the building. Neighboring houses, it must be added, seemed entirely free of the noxious quality. This much I knew before my insistent questioning led my uncle to show me the notes which finally embarked us both on our hideous investigation. In my childhood, the Shunned house was vacant, with barren, gnarled, and terrible old trees, long, queerly pale grass, and nightmarishly misshapen weeds in the high terraced yards where birds never lingered. We boys used to overrun the place, and I can still recall my youthful terror not only at the morbid strangeness of this sinister vegetation, but at the eldritch atmosphere and odor of the dilapidated house, whose unlocked front door was often entered in quest of shutters. The small-paned windows were largely broken, and a nameless air of desolation hung around the precarious paneling, shaky interior shutters, peeling wallpaper, falling plaster, rickety staircases, and such fragments of battered furniture as still remained. The dust and cobwebs added their touch of the fearful, and brave indeed was the boy who would voluntarily ascend the ladder to the attic, a vast, raftered length lighted only by small blinking windows in the gable ends, and filled with a massed wreckage of chests, chairs, and spinning wheels, which infinite years of deposit had shrouded and festooned into monstrous and hellish shapes. But, after all, the attic was not the most terrible part of the house. It was the dank, humid cellar, which somehow exerted the strongest repulsion on us. even though it was wholly above ground on the street side, with only a thin door and window-pierced brick wall to separate it from the busy sidewalk. We scarcely knew whether to haunt it in spectral fascination or to shun it for the sake of our souls and our sanity. For one thing, the bad odor of the house was strongest there, and for another thing, we did not like the white fungus growth which occasionally sprang up in rainy summer weather from the hard earth floor. Those fungi, grotesquely like the vegetation in the yard outside, were truly horrible in their outlines. Detestable parodies of toadstools and Indian pipes, whose like we had never seen in any other situation. They rotted quickly and at one stage became slightly phosphorescent, so that nocturnal passers-by sometimes spoke of witch fires glowing behind the broken panes of the photo-spreading windows. We never, even in our wildest Halloween moods, visited this cellar by night, but in some of our daytime visits could detect the phosphorescence, especially when the day was dark and wet. There was also a subtler thing we often thought we detected, a very strange thing which was, however, merely suggestive at most. I refer to the sort of cloudy whitish pattern on the dirt floor, a vague shifting deposit of mold or niter which we sometimes thought we could trace amidst the sparse fungus growths near the huge fireplace of the basement kitchen. Once in a while, it struck us that this patch bore an uncanny resemblance to a doubled-up human figure, though generally no such kinship existed, and often there was no whitish deposit whatever. On a certain rainy afternoon, when this illusion seemed phenomenally strong, and when, in addition, I had fancied I glimpsed a kind of thin, yellowish, shimmering exhalation rising from the nitrous pattern toward the yawning fireplace, I spoke to my uncle about the matter. He smiled at this odd conceit, but it seemed that his smile was tinged with reminiscence. Later I heard that a similar notion entered into some of the wild ancient tales of the common folk, a notion likewise alluding to ghoulish, wolfish shapes taken by smoke from the great chimney, and queer contours assumed by certain of the sinuous tree roots that thrust their way into the cellar through the loose foundation stones. Not until my adult years did my uncle set before me the notes and data which he had collected concerning the Shunned house. Dr. Whipple was a sane, conservative physician of the old school, and for all his interest in the place was not eager to encourage young thoughts toward the abnormal. His own view, postulating simply a building and location of markedly unsanitary qualities, had nothing to do with abnormality, but he realized that the very picturesqueness which aroused his own interest would, in a boy's fanciful mind, take on all manner of gruesome, imaginative associations. The doctor was a bachelor, a white-haired, clean-shaven, old-fashioned gentleman, and a local historian of note who had often broke a lance with such controversial guardians of tradition as Sidney S. Ryder and Thomas W. Bicknell. He lived with one manservant in a Georgian homestead with knocker and iron-railed steps, balanced eerily on a steep ascent of North Court Street, beside the ancient brick court and colony house where his grandfather, a cousin of that celebrated privateersman, Captain Wimple, who burnt His Majesty's armed schooner Gaspé in 1772, had voted in the legislature on May 4th, 1776, for the independence of the Rhode Island colony. Around him, in the damp, low-ceiled library with the musty white paneling, heavy carved-over mantel, and small-paned, vine-shaded windows were the relics and records of his ancient family, among which were many dubious allusions to the Shunned house in Benefit Street. That pest spot lies not far distant, for Benefit runs ledgewise just above the courthouse along the precipitous hill up which the first settlement climbed. When in the end my insistent pestering and maturing years evoked from my uncle the hoarded lore I sought, there lay before me a strange enough chronicle. A long-winded, statistical, and drearily genealogical as some of the matter was, there reigned through it a continuous thread of brooding, tenacious horror and preternatural malevolence which impressed me even more than it had impressed the good doctor. Separate events fitted together uncannily, and seemingly irrelevant details held minds of hideous possibilities. A new and burning curiosity grew in me, compared to which my boyish curiosity was feeble and inchoate. The first revelation led to an exhaustive research, and finally to that shuddering quest which proved so disastrous to myself and mine. For at last my uncle insisted on joining the search I had commenced, and after a certain night in that house, he did not come away with me. I am lonely without that gentle soul, whose long years were filled only with honor, virtue, good taste, benevolence, and learning. I have reared a marble urn to his memory in St. John's Churchyard, the place that Poe loved, the hidden grove of giant willows on the hill, where tombs and headstones huddled quietly between the hoary bulk of the church and the houses and bank walls of Benefit Street. The history of the house, opening amidst a maze of dates, revealed no trace of the sinister, either about its construction or about the preposterous and honorable family who built it. Yet, from the first, a taint of calamity, soon increased to boding significance, was apparent. My uncle's carefully compiled record began with the building of the structure in 1763, and followed the theme with an unusual amount of detail. The Shunned house, it seems, was first inhabited by William Harris and his wife, Roby Dexter, with their children, Elkanah, born in 1755, Abigail, born in 1757, William Jr., born in 1759, and Ruth, born in 1761. Harris was a substantial merchant and seaman in the West India trade, connected with the firm of Obadiah Brown and his nephews. After Brown's death in 1761, the new firm of Nicholas Brown and Company made him master of the brig Prudence, Providence built, of 120 tons, thus enabling him to erect the new homestead he had desired ever since his marriage. The site he had chosen, a recently straightened part of the new and fashionable back street, which ran along the side of the hill above crowded Cheapside, was all that could be wished, and the building did justice to the location. It was the best that moderate means could afford, and Harris hastened to move in before the birth of a fifth child which the family expected. That child, a boy, came in December, but was stillborn. Nor was any child to be born alive in that house for a century and a half. The next April sickness occurred among the children, and Abigail and Ruth died before the month was over. Dr. Job Ives diagnosed the trouble as some infantile fever, though others declared it was more of a mere wasting away or decline. It seemed, in any event, to be contagious, for Hannah Bowman, one of the two servants, died of it in the following June. Eli Ledison, the other servant, constantly complained of weakness, and would have returned to his father's farm in Rehoboth, but for a sudden attachment for Maidabel Pierce, who was hired to succeed Hannah. He died the next year, a sad year indeed, since it marked the death of William Harris himself, enfeebled as he was by the climate of Martinique, where his occupation had kept him for considerable periods during the preceding decade. The widowed Roby Harris never recovered from the shock of her husband's death, and the passing of her firstborn, Elkanah, 2 years later, was the final blow to her reason. In 1768, she fell victim to a mild form of insanity, and was thereafter confined to the upper part of the house, her elder maiden sister, Mercy Dexter, having moved in to take charge of the family. Mercy was a plain, raw-boned woman of great strength, but her health visibly declined from the time of her advent. She was greatly devoted to her unfortunate sister, and had an especial affection for her only surviving nephew, William, who had, from a sturdy infant, become a sickly, spindling lad. In this year, the servant, Maidabel, died, and the other servant, Preserved Smith, left without coherent explanation, or at least with only some wild tales and a complaint that he disliked the smell of the place. For a time, Mercy could secure no more help, since the 7 deaths, in case of madness, all occurring within 5 years' space, had begun to set in motion the body of fireside rumor which later became so bizarre. Ultimately, however, she obtained new servants from out of town. Anne White, a morose woman from that part of North Kingstown, now set off as the township of Exeter, and a capable Boston man named Zenas Lowe. It was Anne White who first gave definitive shape to the sinister idle talk. Mercy should have known better than to hire anyone from Nooseneck Hill country, for that remote bit of backwoods was then, as now, a seat of the most uncomfortable superstitions. As lately as 1892, an Exeter community exhumed a dead body and ceremoniously burnt its heart in order to prevent certain alleged visitations injurious to the public health and peace, and one may imagine the point of view of the same section in 1768. Anne's tongue was perniciously active, and within a few months Mercy discharged her, filling her place with a faithful and amiable Amazon from Newport, Maria Robbins. While poor Roby Harris, in her madness, gave voice to dreams and imaginings of the most hideous sort. At times her screams became insupportable, and for long periods she would utter shrieking horrors, which necessitated her son's temporary residence with his cousin, Peleg Harris, in Presbyterian Lane near the new college building. The boy would seem to improve after these visits, and had Mercy been as wise as she was well-meaning, she would have let him live permanently with Peleg. Just what Miss Harris cried out in her fits of violence, tradition hesitates to say, or rather presents such extravagant accounts that they nullify themselves through sheer absurdity. Certainly, it sounds absurd to hear that a woman educated only in the rudiments of French often shouted for hours in a coarse and idiomatic form of that language, or that the same person, alone and guarded, complained wildly of a staring thing which bit and chewed at her. In 1772 the servant Zenas died, and when Mrs. Harris heard of it, she laughed with a shockingly delight utterly foreign to her. The next year she herself died, and was laid to rest in the North Burial Ground beside her husband. Upon the outbreak of trouble with Great Britain in 1775, William Harris, despite his scant 16 years and feeble constitution, managed to enlist in the Army of Observation under General Greene, and from that time on enjoyed a steady rise in health and prestige. In 1780, as a captain in Rhode Island forces in New Jersey under Colonel Angell, he met and married Phoebe Hetfield of Elizabethtown, whom he brought to Providence upon his honorable discharge in the following year. The young soldier's return was not a thing of unmitigated happiness. The house, in its true, was still in good condition, and the street had been widened and changed in name from Back Street to Benefit Street. But Mercy Dexter's once robust frame had undergone a sad and curious decay, so that she was now a stooped and pathetic figure with hollow voice and disconcerting pallor, qualities shared to a singular degree by the one remaining servant, Maria. In the autumn of 1872, Phoebe Harris gave birth to a stillborn daughter, and on the 15th of the next May, Mercy Dexter took leave of a useful, austere, and virtuous life. William Harris, at last thoroughly convinced of the radically unhealthful nature of his abode, now took steps toward quitting it and closing it forever. Securing temporary quarters for himself and his wife at the newly opened Golden Ball Inn, he arranged for the building of a new and finer house in Westminster Street, in the growing part of the town across the Great Bridge. There, in 1785, his son Duty was born, and there the family dwelt till the encroachments of commerce drove them back across the river and over the hill to Angel Hill, in the new East Side residence district, where the late Archer Harris built his sumptuous but hideous French-roofed mansion in 1876. William and Phoebe both succumbed to the yellow fever epidemic of 1797, but Duty was brought up by his cousin, Rathbone Harris, Peleg's son. Rathbone was a practical man and rented the Benefit Street house despite William's wish to keep it vacant. He considered it an obligation to his ward to make the most of all the boy's property, nor did he concern himself with the deaths and illnesses which caused so many changes of tenants, or the steadily growing aversion with which the house was generally regarded. It is likely that he only felt vexation when, in 1804, the town council ordered him to fumigate the place with sulfur, tar, and gum camphor on account of the much-discussed deaths of 4 persons, presumably caused by the then diminishing fever epidemic. They said the place had a febrile smell. Duty himself thought little of the house, for he grew up to be a privateersman and served with distinction on the Vigilant under Captain Cahoon in the War of 1812. He returned unharmed, married in 1814, and became a father on that memorable night of September 23, 1815, when a great gale drove the waters of the bay over half the town and floated a tall sloop well up Westminster Street so that its masts almost tapped the Harris windows in symbolic information that the new boy, Welcome, was a seaman's son. Welcome did not survive his father, but lived to perish gloriously at Fredericksburg in 1862. Neither he nor his son Archer knew of the Shunned house as other than a nuisance almost impossible to rent, perhaps on account of the mustiness and sickly odor of unkept old age. Indeed, it was never rented, after a series of deaths culminating in 1861, which the excitement of the war tended to throw into obscurity. Carrington Harris, last of the male line, knew it only as a deserted and somewhat picturesque center of legend until I told him my experience. He had meant to tear it down and build an apartment house on the site, but after my account decided to let it stand, install plumbing, and rent it. Nor has he yet had any difficulty in obtaining tenants. The horror is gone. It may well be imagined how powerfully I was affected by the annals of the Harrises. In this continuous record, there seemed to me to brood a persistent evil beyond anything in nature as I had known, an evil clearly connected with the house and not with the family. This impression was confirmed by my uncle's less systemic array of miscellaneous data, legends transcribed from servant gossip, cuttings from the papers, copies of death certificates by fellow physicians, and the like. All of this material I cannot hope to give, for my uncle was a tireless antiquarian and very deeply interested in the Shunned house. But I may refer to several dominant points which earned notice by their recurrence through many reports from diverse sources. For example, the servant gossip was practically unanimous in attributing to the fungus and malodorous cellar of the house a vast supremacy in evil influence. There had been servants, and white especially, who would not use the cellar kitchen, and at least 3 well-defined legends bore upon the queer quasi-human or diabolic outlines assumed by tree roots and patches of mold in that region. These latter narratives interested me profoundly on account of what I had seen in my boyhood, but I felt most of the significance had in each case been largely obscured by additions from the common stock of local ghost lore. Anne White, with her Exeter superstition, had promulgated the most extravagant and at the same time most consistent tale, alleging that there must lie buried beneath the house one of those vampires, the dead who retain their bodily form and live on the blood or breath of the living, whose hideous legions send their preying shapes or spirits abroad by night. To destroy a vampire, one must, as grandmothers say, exhume it and burn its heart, or at least drive a stake through that organ, and Anne's dogged insistence on a search under the cellar had been prominent in bringing about her discharge. Her tales, however, commanded a wide audience, and were the more readily accepted because the house indeed stood on land once used for burial purposes. To me, their interest depended less on this circumstance than on the peculiarly appropriated way in which they dovetailed with certain other things. The complaint of the departing servant, Preserved Smith, who had preceded Anne and never heard of her, that something sucked his breath at night. The death certificates of fever victims of 1804, issued by Dr. Chad Hopkins, and the showing the 4 deceased persons all unaccountably lacking in blood, and the obscure passages of poor Roby Harris's ravings, where she complained of the sharp teeth of a glassy-eyed, half-visible presence. Free from unwarranted superstition though I am, these things produced in me an odd sensation, which was intensified by a pair of widely separated newspaper cuttings relating to deaths in the Shunned house. One from the Providence Gazette and Country, Journal of April 12, 1815, and the other from the Daily Transcript and Chronicle of October 27, 1845, each of which detailed an appallingly grisly circumstance whose duplication was remarkable. It seems that in both instances the dying person, in 1815 a gentle old lady named Stafford, and in 1845 a schoolteacher of middle age named Eleazar Durfree, became transfigured in a horrible way, glaring glassily and attempting to bite the throat of the attending physician. Even more puzzlingly, though, was the final case which put an end to the renting of the house, a series of anemia deaths preceded by progressive madnesses wherein the patient would craftily attempt the lives of his relatives by incisions in the neck or wrist. This was in 1860 or 1861, when my uncle had just begun his medical practice, and before leaving for the front he heard much of it from his elder professional colleagues. The really inexplicable thing was the way in which the victims, ignorant people, for the ill-smelling and widely shunned house could now be rented to no others, would babble maledictions in French, a language they could not possibly have studied to any extent. It made one think of poor Roby Harris nearly a century before, and so moved my uncle that he commenced collecting historical data on the house after listening, sometime subsequent to his return from the war, to the first-hand account of Doctors Chase and Whitemarsh. Indeed, I could see that my uncle had thought deeply on the subject, and that he was glad of my own interest, an open-minded and sympathetic interest which enabled him to discuss with me matters at which others would merely have laughed. His fancy had not gone so far as mine, but he felt that the place was rare in its imaginative potentialities, and worthy of note as an inspiration in the field of the grotesque and macabre. For my part, I was disposed to take the whole subject with profound seriousness, and began at once not only to review the evidence, but to accumulate as much more as I could. I talked with the elderly Archer Harris, then owner of the house, many times before his death in 1916, and obtained from him and his still surviving maiden sister Alice an authentic corroboration of all the family data my uncle had collected. When, however, I asked them what connection with France or its language the house could have, they confessed themselves as frankly baffled and ignorant as I. Archer knew nothing, and all that Miss Harris could say was that an old illusion her grandfather, Duty Harris, had heard of might shed a little light. The old seaman, who had survived his son Welcome's death in battle by 2 years, had not himself known the legend, but recalled that his earliest nurse, the ancient Maria Robbins, seemed darkly aware of something that might have lent a weird significance to the French ravings of Roby Harris, which she had so often heard during the last days of that hapless woman. Maria had been at the Shunned house from 1769 till the removal of the family in 1783, and had seen Mercy Dexter die. Once she hinted to the child duty of a somewhat peculiar circumstance in Mercy's last moments, but he had soon forgotten all about it, save it was something peculiar. The granddaughter, moreover, recalled even this much with difficulty. She and her brother were not so much interested in the house as was Archer's son Carrington, the present owner, with whom I talked after my experience. Having exhausted the Harris family of all information it could furnish, I turned my attention to early town records and deeds with a zeal more penetrating than that which my uncle had occasionally shown in the same work. What I wished was a comprehensive history of the site from its very settlement in 1636, or even before, if any Narragansett Indian legend could be unearthed so to supply the data. I found at the start that the land had been part of the long strip of home lot granted originally to John Throckmorton, one of many similar strips beginning at the town street beside the river and extending up the hill to a line roughly corresponding with the modern Hope Street. The Throckmorton lot had later, of course, been much subdivided, and I became very assiduous in tracing that section through which Back or Benefit Street was later run. It had, a rumor indeed said, been the Throckmorton graveyard, but as I examined the records more carefully, I found that the graves had all been transferred at an early date to the North Burial Ground on the Pawtucket West Road. Then suddenly I came, by a rare piece of chance, since it's not in the main body of records and might easily have been missed, upon something which aroused my keenest eagerness, fitting in as it did with several of the queerest phases of the affair. It was the record of a lease in 1697 of a small tract of ground to an Etienne Roulet and wife. At last the French element had appeared. That, and another deeper element of horror which the name conjured up from the darkest recesses of my weird and heterogeneous reading, and I feverishly studied the platting of the locality as it had been before the cutting through and partial straightening of Back Street between 1747 and 1758. I found what I had half expected, that where the Shunned house now stood, the Roulets had laid out their graveyard behind a one-story and attic cottage, and that no record of any transfer of graves existed. The document, indeed, ended in much confusion, and I was forced to ransack both the Rhode Island Historical Society and Shepley Library before I could find a local door which the name Etienne Roulet would unlock. In the end, I did find something of such vague but monstrous import that I set about at once to examine the cellar of the Shunned house itself with a new and excited minuteness. The Roulets, it seemed, had come in 1696 from East Greenwich, down the west shore of Narragansett Bay. They were Huguenots from Caude, and had encountered much opposition before the Providence selectmen allowed them to settle in the town. Unpopularity had dogged them in East Greenwich, whither they had come in 1886, after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, and rumor said that the cause of dislike extended beyond mere racial and national prejudice, or the land disputes which involved other French settlers with the English, and rivalries which not even Governor Andros could quell. But their ardent Protestantism, too ardent, some whispered, and their evident distress when virtually driven from the village down the bay had moved the sympathy of the town fathers. Here the strangers had been granted a haven, and the swarthy Etienne Roulet, less apt at agriculture than at reading queer books and drawing queer diagrams, was given a clerical post in the warehouse at Pardon Tillinghast Wharf, far south in Town Street. There had, however, been a riot of some sort later on, perhaps 40 years later, after old Roulet's death, and no one seemed to hear of the family after that. For a century and more, it appeared the Roulets had been well remembered and frequently discussed as vivid incidents in the quiet life of a New England seaport. Etienne's son, Paul, a surly fellow whose erotic conduct had probably provoked the riot which wiped out the family, was particularly a source of speculation. And though Providence never shared the witchcraft panics of her Puritan neighbors, it was freely intimated by old wives that his prayers were neither uttered at the proper time nor directed toward the proper object. All of this had undoubtedly formed the basis of the legend known by Old Maria Robbins. What relation it had to the French ravings of Roby Harris and other inhabitants of the Shunned house, imagination or future discovery alone could determine. I wondered how many of those who had known the legends realized that additional link with the terrible which my wide reading had given me, that ominous item in the annals of morbid horror which tells of the creature Jacques Roulet of Caude, who in 1598 was condemned to death as a demonic, but afterward saved from the stake by the Paris Parliament and shut in a madhouse. He had been found covered with blood and shreds of flesh in a wood, shortly after the killing and rending of a boy by a pair of wolves. One wolf was seen to lope away unhurt, surely a pretty hearthside tale with a queer significance as to name and place, but I decided that the Providence gossips could not have generally known of it. Had they known, the coincidence of names would have brought some drastic and frightened action. Indeed, might not its whispering have precipitated the final riot which erased the Roulets from town? I now visited the accursed place with increased frequency, studying the unwholesome vegetation of the garden, examining all the walls of the building, and poring over every inch of the earthen cellar floor. Finally, with Carrington Harris's permission, I fitted a key to the disused door opening from the cellar directly upon Benefit Street, preferring to have a more immediate access to the outside world than the dark stairs, ground floor hall, and front door could give. There, where morbidity lurked most thickly, I searched and poked during long afternoons when the sunlight filtered in through the cobwebbed above-ground windows, and a sense of security glowed from the unlocked door which placed me only a few feet from the placid sidewalk outside. Nothing new rewarded my efforts, only the same distressing mustiness and faint suggestions of noxious odors and nitrous outlines on the floor. And I fancy that many pedestrians must have watched me curiously through the broken panes. At length, upon a suggestion of my uncle's, I decided to try the spot nocturnally, and one stormy midnight ran the beams of an electric torch over the moldy floor with its uncanny shapes and distorted, half-phosphorescent fungi. The place had dispirited me curiously that evening, and I was almost prepared when I saw, or thought I saw, amidst the whitish deposits, particularly sharp definition of the huddled form I had suspected from boyhood. Its clearness was astonishing and unprecedented, and as I watched, I seemed to see again the thin, yellowish, shimmering exhalation which had startled me on that rainy afternoon so many years before. Above the anthropomorphic patch of mold by the fireplace it rose, a subtle, sickish, almost luminous vapor, which, as it hung trembling in the dampness, seemed to develop vague and shocking suggestions of form, gradually trailing off into nebulous decay and passing up into the blackness of the great chimney with a fodor in its wake. It was truly horrible, and the more so to me because of what I knew of the spot. Refusing to flee, I watched it fade, and as I watched, I felt that it was in turn watching me greedily, with eyes more imaginable than visible. When I told my uncle about it, he was greatly aroused, and after a tense hour of reflection arrived at a definite and drastic decision. Weighing in his mind the importance of the matter and the significance of our relationship to it, he insisted that we both test, and if possible destroy, the horror of the house by a joint night or nights of aggressive vigil in that musty and fungus-cursed cellar. On Wednesday, June 25th, 1919, with a proper notification of Carrington Harris, which did not include surmises as to what we expected to find, my uncle and I conveyed to the Shunned house 2 camp chairs and a folding camp cot, together with some scientific mechanism of greater weight and intricacy. These were placed in the cellar during the day, screening the windows with paper and planning to return in the evening for our first vigil. We had locked the door from the cellar to the ground floor, and having a key to the outside cellar door, we were prepared to leave our expensive and delicate apparatus, which we had obtained secretly and at great cost, as many days as our vigils might need to be protracted. It was our design to sit up together till very late, and then watch singly till dawn in 2-hour stretches. Myself first, then my companion, the inactive member, resting on the cot. The natural leadership with which my uncle procured the instruments from the laboratories of Brown University and the Cranston Street Armory, and instinctively assumed direction of our venture, was a marvelous commentary on the potential vitality and resilience of a man of 81. Elihu Whipple had lived accordingly to the hygienic laws he had preached as a physician, and, but for what happened later, would be here in full vigor today. Only 2 persons suspect what did happen, Carrington Harris and myself. I had to tell Harris because he owned the house, and deserved to know what had gone out of it. Then, too, we had spoken to him in advance of our quest, and I felt upon my uncle's going that he would understand and assist me in some vitally necessary public explanations. He turned very pale, but he agreed to help me, and decided that it would now be safe to rent the house. To declare that we were not nervous on that rainy night of watching would be an exaggeration, both gross and ridiculous. We were not, as I have said, in any sense childishly superstitious, but scientific study and the reflection had taught us that the known universe of 3 dimensions embraces the merest fraction of the whole cosmos of substance and energy. In this case, an overwhelming preponderance of evidence from numerous authentic sources pointed to the tenacious existence of certain forces of great power, and so far as the human point of view is concerned, exceptional malignancy. To say that we actually believed in vampires or werewolves would be a carelessly inclusive statement. Rather, must it be said that we were not prepared to deny the possibility of certain unfamiliar and unclassified modifications of vital force and attenuated matter, existing very infrequently in 3-dimensional space because of its more intimate connection with other spatial units, yet close enough to the boundary of our own to furnish us occasional manifestations which we, for lack of a proper vantage point, may never hope to understand. In short, it seemed to my uncle and me that any incontrovertible array of facts pointed to some lingering influence in the Shunned house, traceable to one or another of the ill-favored French settlers of 2 centuries before, and still operative through rare and unknown laws of atomic and electronic motion. That the family of Roulet had possessed an abnormal affinity for outer circles of entity, dark spheres, which for normal folk hold only repulsion and terror, their recorded history seemed to prove. Had not, then, the riots of those bygone 1730s set moving certain kinetic patterns in the morbid brain of one or more of them, notably the sinister Paul Roulet, which obscurely survived the bodies murdered and buried by the mob, and continued to function in some multiple-dimension space along the original lines of force, determined by a frantic hatred of the encroaching community? Such a thing was surely not a physical or biochemical impossibility in the light of a newer science, which includes the theories of relativity and intra-atomic action. One might easily imagine an alien nucleus of substance or energy, formless or otherwise, kept alive by imperceptible or immaterial subtractions from the life force or bodily tissues and fluids of other and more palpably living things into which it penetrates, and with whose fabric it sometimes completely merges itself. It might be actively hostile, or it might be dictated merely by blind motives of self-preservation. In any such case, a monster must of necessity be in our scheme of things an anomaly and an intruder, whose extirpation forms a primary duty with every man not an enemy to the world's life, health, and sanity. What baffled us was our utter ignorance of the aspect in which we might encounter the thing. No sane person had ever seen it, and few had ever felt it definitely. It might be pure energy, a form ethereal and outside the realm of substance, or it might be partly material, some unknown and unequivocal mass of plasticity capable of changing at will to nebulous approximations of the solid, liquid, gaseous, or tenuously unparticled states. The anthropomorphic patch of mold on the floor, the form of the yellow vapor, and the curvature of the tree roots in some of the old tales, all argued at least a remote and reminiscent connection with the human shape. But how representative or permanent that similarity might be, none could say with any kind of certainty. We had devised 2 weapons to fight it. A large and specially fitted Crookes tube operated by powerful storage batteries and provided with peculiar screens and reflectors in case it proved intangible and opposable only by vigorously destructive ether radiations, and a pair of military flamethrowers of the sort used in the World War in case it proved partially material and susceptible of mechanical destruction. For like the superstitious Exeter rustics, we were prepared to burn the thing's heart out if heart existed to burn. All this aggressive mechanism we set in the cellar in positions carefully arranged with reference to the cot and chairs, and to the spot before the fireplace where the mold had taken strange shapes. That suggestive patch, by the way, was only faintly visible when we placed our furniture and instruments, and when we returned that evening for the actual vigil. For a moment, I have doubted that I ever even seen it in a more definitely limned form, but then I thought of the legends. Our cellar vigil began at 10 p.m., daylight saving time, and as it continued, we found no promise of pertinent developments. A weak filtered glow from the rain-harassed street lamps outside, and a feeble phosphorescence from the detestable fungi within showed the dripping stone of the walls, from which all traces of whitewash had vanished. The dank, foded, and mildew-tainted hard earth floor with its obscene fungi, the rotting remains of what had been stools, chairs, and tables, and other more shapeless furniture, the heavy planks and massive beams of the ground floor overhead, the decrepit plank door leading to bins and chambers beneath other parts of the house, the crumbling stone staircase with ruined wood handrail, and the crude and cavernous fireplace of blackened brick, where rusted iron fragments revealed the past presence of hooks and irons, spit, crane, and a door to the Dutch oven. These things, and our austere cot and camp chairs, and the heavy and intricate destructive machinery we had brought. We had, as in my own former explorations, left the door to the street unlocked, so that a direct and practical path of escape might lie open in case of manifestations beyond our power to deal with. It was our idea that our continued nocturnal presence would call forth whatever malign entity lurked there, and that being prepared, we could dispose of the thing with one or the other of our provided means as soon as we had recognized and observed it sufficiently. How long it might require to evoke and extinguish the thing, we had no notion. It occurred to us, too, that our venture was far from safe, for in what strength that thing might appear no one could tell. But we deemed the game worth the hazard, and embarked on it alone and unhesitatingly, conscious that the seeking of the outside aid would only expose us to ridicule and perhaps defeat our entire purpose. Such was our frame of mind as we talked far into the night, till my uncle's growing drowsiness made me remind him to lie down for his 2-hour sleep. Something like fear chilled me as I sat there in the small hours, alone. I say alone, for one who sits by a sleeper is indeed alone, perhaps more alone than he can realize. My uncle breathed heavily, his deep inhalations and exhalations accompanied by the rain outside, and punctuated by another nerve-wracking sound of distant dripping water within, for the house was repulsively damp even in dry weather, and in this storm positively swamp-like. I studied the loose antique masonry of the walls and the fungus, light and the feeble rays which stole in from the street through the screened windows, and once, when the noisome atmosphere of the place seemed about to sicken me, I opened the door and looked up and down the street, feasting my eyes on familiar sights and my nostrils on the wholesome air. Still, nothing occurred to reward my watching, and I yawned repeatedly, fatigue getting the better of apprehension. Then the stirring of my uncle in his sleep attracted my notice. He had turned restlessly on the cot several times during the latter half of the first hour, but now he was breathing with unusual irregularity, occasionally heaving a sigh which held more than a few of the qualities of a choking moan. I turned my electric flashlight on him and found his face averted, so rising and crossing to the other side of the cot, I again flashed the light to see if he seemed in any pain. What I saw unnerved me most surprisingly, considering its relative triviality. It must have been merely the association of any odd circumstance with the sinister nature of our location and mission, for surely the circumstance was not in itself frightful or unnatural. It was merely that my uncle's facial expression, disturbed no doubt by the strange dreams which our situation prompted, betrayed considerable agitation, and seemed not at all characteristic of him. His habitual expression was one of kindly and well-bred calm, whereas now a variety of emotions seemed struggling within him. I think, on the whole, that it was this variety which chiefly disturbed me. My uncle, as he gasped and tossed in increasing perturbation, and with eyes that now started open, seemed not one but many men, and suggested a curious quality of alienage from himself. All at once he commenced to mutter, and I did not like the look of his mouth and teeth as he spoke. The words were at first indistinguishable, and then, with a tremendous start, I recognized something about them which filled me with icy fear till I recalled the breadth of my uncle's education and the interminable translations he had made from anthropological and antiquarian articles in the Rêve du Monde. For the venerable Eli Whipple was muttering in French, and the few phrases I could distinguish seemed connected with the darkest myths he had ever adapted from the famous Paris magazine. Suddenly a perspiration broke out on the sleeper's forehead, and he leaped abruptly up, half awake. The jumble of French changed to a cry in English, and the hoarse voice shouted excitedly, "My breath! My breath!" The near-awakening became complete, and with a subsidence of facial expression to the normal state, my uncle seized my hand and began to relate a dream whose nucleus of significance I could only surmise with a kind of awe. He had, he said, floated off from a very ordinary series of dream pictures into a scene whose strangeness was related to nothing he had ever read. It was of this world, and yet not of it. A shadowy geometrical confusion in which he could be seen elements of familiar things in most unfamiliar and perturbing combinations. There was a suggestion of queerly disordered pictures superimposed one upon another, an arrangement in which the essentials of time as well as of space seemed dissolved and mixed in the most illogical fashion. In this kaleidoscope vortex of phantasmal images were occasional snapshots, if one might use the term, of singular clearness but unaccountable heterogeneity. Once my uncle thought he lay in a carelessly dug open pit, with a crowd of angry faces framed by straggling locks and three-cornered hats frowning down on him. Again he seemed to be in the interior of a house, an old house apparently, but the details and inhabitants were constantly changing, and he could never be certain of the faces or the furniture, or even of the room itself, since doors and windows seemed in just as great a state of flux as the more presumably mobile objects. It was queer, damnably clear, and my uncle spoke almost sheepishly, as if half expecting not to be believed, when he declared that of the strange faces many had unmistakably borne the features of the Harris family. And all the while there was a personal sensation of choking, as if some pervasive presence had spread itself through his body and sought to possess itself of his vital processes. I shuddered at the thought of those vital processes, worn as they were by 81 years of continuous functioning, in conflict with unknown forces of which the youngest and the strongest system might well be afraid. But in another moment reflected that dreams are only dreams, and that these uncomfortable visions could be at most no more than my uncle's reaction to the investigations and expectations which had lately filled our minds to the exclusion of all else. Conversation also soon tended to dispel my sense of strangeness, and in time I yielded to my yawns and took my turn at slumber. My uncle seemed now very wakeful, and welcomed his period of watching, even though the nightmare had aroused him far ahead of his allotted 2 hours. Sleep seized me quickly, and I was at once haunted with dreams of the most disturbing kind. I felt in my visions a cosmic and abysmal loneness, with hostility surging from all sides upon some prison where I lay confined. I seemed bound and gagged, and taunted by the echoing yells of distant multitudes who thirsted for my blood. My uncle's face came to me with less pleasant associations than in waking hours, and I recall many futile struggles and attempts to scream. It was not a pleasant sleep, and for a second I was not sorry for the echoing shriek which clove through the barriers of dream and flung me to a sharp and startled awakeness in which every actual object before my eyes stood out with more than natural clearness and reality. I had been lying with my face away from my uncle's chair, so that in this sudden flash of awakening I saw only the door to the street, the more northerly window, and the wall and floor and ceiling toward the north of the room, all photographed with morbid vividness on my brain, in a light brighter than the glow of the fungi or the rays from the street outside. It was not a strong or even fairly strong light, certainly not nearly strong enough to read an average book by, but it cast a shadow of myself and the cot on the floor, and had a yellowish, penetrating force that hinted at things more potent than luminosity. This I perceived with unhealthy sharpness, despite the fact that 2 of my other senses were violently assailed. For on my ears rang the reverberations of that shocking scream, while my nostrils revolted at the stench which filled the place. My mind, as alert as my senses, recognized the gravely unusual, and almost automatically I leapt up and turned about to grasp the destructive instruments which we had left trained on the moldy spot before the fireplace. As I turned, I dreaded what I was to see, for the scream had been in my uncle's voice, and I knew not against what menace I should have to defend him and myself. Yet after all, the sight was worse than I had dreaded. There were horrors beyond horrors, and this was one of those nuclei of all dreamable hideousness which the cosmos saves to blast an accursed and unhappy few. Out of the fungus-ridden earth steamed up a vaporous corpse light, yellow and deceased, which bubbled and lapped to a gigantic height in vague outlines half-human and half-monstrous, through which I could see the chimney and fireplace beyond. It was all eyes, wolfish and mocking, and the rugose insect-like head dissolved at the top to a thin stream of mist, which curled putridly about, and finally vanished up the chimney. I say I saw this thing, but it is only in conscious retrospection that I ever definitely traced its damnable approach to form. At the time, it was to me only a seething, dimly phosphorescent cloud of fungus loathsomeness, enveloping and dissolving to an abhorrent plasticity the one object to which all my attention was focused. That object was my uncle, the venerable Elihu Whipple, who, with blackening and decaying features, leered and gibbered at me, and reached out dripping claws to rend me in the fury which this horror had brought. It was a sense of routine which kept me from going mad. I had drilled myself in preparation for the crucial moment, and blind training saved me. Recognizing the bubbling evil as no substance reachable by matter or material chemistry, and therefore ignoring the flamethrower which loomed on my left, I threw on the current of Crook's tube apparatus and focused toward that scene of immortal blasphemousness, the strongest ether radiations which man's art can arouse from the spaces and fluids of nature. There was a bluish haze and a frenzied sputtering, and the yellowish phosphorescence grew dimmer to my eyes. But I saw the dimness was only that of contrast, and that the waves from the machine had no effect whatever. Then, in the midst of that demonic spectacle, I saw a fresh horror which brought cries to my lips and sent me fumbling and staggering toward that unlocked door to the quiet street, careless of what abnormal terrors I loosed on the world, or what thoughts or judgments of men I brought down upon my head. In that dim blend of blue and yellow, the form of my uncle had commenced a nauseous liquefaction whose essence eludes all description, and in which there played across his vanishing face such changes of identity as only madness can conceive. He was at once a devil in a multitude, a carnal house in a pageant. Lit by the mixed and uncertain beams, that gelatinous face assumed a dozen, a score, 100 aspects, grinning as it sank to the ground on a body that melted like tallow, in a caricatured likeness of legions strange and yet not strange. I saw the features of the Harris line, masculine and feminine, adult and infantile, and other features, old and young, coarse and refined, familiar and unfamiliar. For a second, there flashed a degraded counterfeit of a miniature of poor mad Roby Harris that I had seen in the School of Design Museum, and another time I thought I saw the raw-boned imagery of Mercy Dexter as I recalled her from a painting in Carrington Harris's house. It was frightful beyond conception. Toward the last, when a curious blend of servant and baby visages flickered close to the fungus floor where a pool of greenish grease was spreading, it seemed as though the shifting features fought against themselves and strove to form contours like those of my uncle's kindly face. I like to think that he existed at that moment, and that he tried to bid me farewell. It seems to me that I hiccuped a farewell from my own parched throat as I lurched out into the street, a thin stream of grease following me through the door to the rain-drenched sidewalk. The rest is shadowy and monstrous. There was no one in the soaking street, and in all the world there was no one I dared tell. I walked aimlessly south past College Hill and the Athenaeum, down Hopkins Street and over the bridge to the business section, where tall buildings seemed to guard me as modern material things guard the world from ancient and unwholesome wonder. Then gray dawn unfolded wetly from the east, silhouetting the archaic hill and its venerable steeples, and beckoning me to the place where my terrible work was still unfinished. And in the end I went, wet, hatless, and dazed in the morning light, and entered that awful door in Benefit Street, which I had left ajar, and which still swung cryptically in full sight of the early householders to whom I dared not speak. The grease was gone, for the moldy floor was porous, and in front of the fireplace was no vestige of the giant doubled-up form of Nitra. I looked at the cot, the chairs, the instruments, my neglected hat, and the yellow straw hat of my uncle. Dazedness was uppermost, and I could scarcely recall what was dream and what was reality. Then thought trickled back, and I knew that I had witnessed things more horrible than I had dreamed. Sitting down, I tried to conjecture, nearly as sanity would let me, just what had happened, and how I might end the horror, if indeed it had been real. Matter it seemed not to be, nor ether, nor anything else conceivable by mortal mind. What, then, but some exotic emanation, some vampirish vapor, such as Exeter rustics tell of as lurking over certain churchyards? This I felt was the clue, and again I looked at the floor before the fireplace, where the mold and the niter had taken strange forms. In 10 minutes my mind was made up. Taking my hat, I set out for home, where I bathed, ate, and gave by telephone an order for a pickaxe, a spade, a military gas mask, and 6 carboys of sulfuric acid, all to be delivered the next morning at the cellar door of the Shunned house in Benefit Street. After that I tried to sleep, and failing, passed the hours in reading and in composition of inane verses to counteract my mood. At 11 a.m. the next day I commenced digging. It was sunny weather, and I was glad of that. I was still alone, for as much as I feared the unknown horror I sought, there was more fear in the thought of telling anybody. Later I told Harris only through sheer necessity, and because he had heard odd tales from old people which deposed him ever so little toward belief. As I turned up the stinking black earth in front of the fireplace, my spade causing a viscous yellow ichor to ooze from the white fungi which it severed, I trembled at the dubious thoughts of what I might uncover. Some secrets of inner earth are not good for mankind, and this seemed to me one of them. My hand shook perceptibly, but I still delved, after a while standing in the large hole I had made. With the deepening of the hole, which was about 6 feet square, the evil smell increased, and I lost all doubt of my intimate contact with the hellish thing whose emanations had cursed the house for over a century and a half. I wondered what it would look like, what its form and substance would be, and how big it might have waxed through long ages of life-sucking. Then arranging the great carboys of acid around and near 2 sides, so that when necessary I might empty them all down the aperture in quick succession. After that I dumped earth only along the other 2 sides, working more slowly, and donning my gas mask as the smell grew. I was nearly unnerved at my proximity to a nameless thing at the bottom of the pit. Suddenly my spade struck something softer than earth. I shuddered, and made a motion as if to climb out of the hole, which was now as deep as my neck. Then courage returned, and I scraped away more dirt in the light of the electric torch I had provided. The surface I uncovered was fishy and glassy, a kind of semi-putrid congealed jelly with suggestions of translucency. I scraped further and saw that it had form. There was a rift where a part of the substance was folded over. The exposed area was huge and roughly cylindrical, like a mammoth soft blue-white stovepipe doubled in 2, its largest part some 2 feet in diameter. Still more I scraped, and then abruptly I leaped out of the hole and away from that filthy thing, frantically unstopping and tilting the heavy carboys and precipitating the corrosive contents one after another down that carnal gulf and upon the unthinkable abnormality whose titan elbow I had seen. The blinding maelstrom of greenish-yellow vapor, which surged tempestuously up from that hole as the floods of acid descended, will never leave my memory. All along the hill people tell of the yellow day when virulent and horrible fumes arose from the factory waste dumped in the Providence River, but I know how mistaken they are as to the source. They tell, too, of the hideous roar which at the same time came from some disordered water pipe or gas main underground. But again I could correct them if I dared. It was unspeakably shocking, and I did not see how I lived through it. I did faint after emptying the 4th carboy, which I had to handle after the fumes had begun to penetrate my mask, but when I recovered I saw that the hole was emanating no fresh vapors. The 2 remaining carboys I emptied down without particular result, and after a time I felt it safe to shovel the earth back into the pit. It was twilight before I was done, but fear had gone out of that place. The dampness was less foetid, and all the strange fungi had withered to a kind of harmless grayish powder which blew ash-like along the floor. One of the earth's nethermost terrors had perished forever, and if there be hell, it had received at last the demon soul of an unhallowed thing. And as I patted down the last spadeful of mold, I shed the first of the many tears with which I have paid unaffected tribute to my beloved uncle's memory. The next spring, no more pale grass and strange weeds came up in the Shunned House terraced gardens, and shortly afterward, Carrington Harris rented the place. It is still spectral, but its strangeness fascinates me, and I shall find mixed with my relief a queer regret when it's torn down to make way for a tawdry shop or vulgar apartment building. The barren old trees in the yard have begun to bear small, sweet apples, and last year the birds nestled in their gnarled boughs.
New Orleans is a city alive with death. Things have a way of coming back from beyond. There's something about the city that gives everything an extra spark. That sort of force can interact with the world in strange ways. One of those ways was the Fontenot house. It was a small, unremarkable place, just one 4-room shotgun shack among many. No one owned it, as far as anyone knew. No one knew which Fontenots the house had belonged to. It was just there, and it was very haunted. Or so the story went, anyway. As was so often the case, no one telling the story had actually seen any strange goings-on at the house themselves. They hadn't personally seen the flickering lights in the windows at night, or felt the unnatural warmth in the walls, or heard the sounds of a faraway gathering. No one knew anyone who had disappeared, but they knew someone who had. And anyway, there was no reason to believe that it wasn't haunted. Why else would there be stories about it if it wasn't true? There were doubters, of course. There always were. One such was Rene Landry. He had spent all of his 17 years of life in New Orleans, and although he was not so bold as to disbelieve all the stories of the city, he certainly felt that many of them were simple tales to lure tourists. He made the mistake of saying so to a group of friends one night and was challenged to put his money where his mouth was. The bet was simple: spend the night in the Fontenot house. Rene was given a GoPro camera, a mildly drunken send-off, and a strict ultimatum not to leave before sunup. There was no prize on the line, only pride, but that was more than enough. The camera was set to take pictures every minute, easy enough to flip through afterward to get a complete picture of the night. "Maybe you'll get a picture of a ghost," they told him, laughing. "The ghost of peeling wallpaper, more like." Rene held the camera up, gesturing for his friends to lean in for a photo. They smiled and waved as the camera snapped a picture. "First one down," Rene said. "See you 359 photos from now. When you find out the truth, don't be too proud to run, Rene. We'll let you live it down, eventually." "Like I need your approval," he told them. "I don't see any of you going in here at all." The old wooden door shut behind him. Rene clicked on his flashlight to supplement the moonlight filtering in through the grimy windows. He could hear his friends doing ghost impressions on the porch. He smiled and shook his head as he looked around to determine the best place to spend the night. The front porch opened into the bedroom, but the floor was thick with dust, and Rene shuddered to think what sorts of things might be living in the decayed padding of the bed. The leather chair in the corner was no better. It had a musty odor that he could smell from across the room. It stood out even among the overarching smell of dampness that arose from the house in general. Rene began to think it would have been wise to have brought a sleeping bag. He moved on to the living room. His light illuminated a corduroy couch that must have been at least 3 times his age and showed every year of it. It was a faded orange that clashed riotously with the boldly patterned green rug covering most of the floor, while also taking up arms against the mildewed mustard yellow wallpaper. Empty curio shelves painted in various bright hues lined the walls. Even in the dim light, the room's colors were an assault. The dining room was a stark contrast. It was dominated by a large mahogany table and matching chairs, the dark wood standing out like a three-dimensional hole against the cream-colored walls. A towering china cabinet stood against one wall, still filled with dishes. As Rene tilted his head back to take in all of the cabinet, he noted with curiosity that he could no longer touch the ceiling. In the previous two rooms, he had been able to tap it with the flashlight. Now his hand swung freely, with at least a foot of free space remaining. The floor felt even, so he concluded that the ceiling must have been constructed on a slant. It was an oddity, but not when compared to a corduroy couch. The final room was the kitchen. The cabinets stood open and bare, their doors reaching outward in mute pleas to be filled. A large iron stove squatted in one corner. A small alcove opposite it led to a tiny bathroom. A sink, toilet, and rusted metal tub were all crammed into a space that looked like it was intended for a pantry. Rene took a desultory look through the cupboards and rattled the drawers, but found nothing but a few pieces of discarded cutlery. Something was off about the room, but it took several minutes until he realized what it was. There was no back door. There wasn't even a space for one. The cabinets lined the back wall entirely, with the counter running in an unbroken line beneath them. But who had ever heard of a shotgun shack without a back door? It would trap all of the heat from the kitchen inside, making for a miserable summer. Besides which, Rene could see the back porch through one of the kitchen windows. No one could have a porch you couldn't get to from the inside of the house. The slanted ceiling was weird, but this was just plain crazy. Rene tapped his hand along the back wall below the cabinets, searching for a weak spot, a seam, anything to show where a door had once been. The wall was oddly warm under his hand, the plaster uncomfortably soft. It felt like putty under his fingertips, though it did not yield. He leaned in, holding the flashlight close to concentrate the light. The textured pattern of the plaster crawled away from the light, wriggling away like there was something live beneath it. Rene jerked backward, taking several brisk steps away from the wall. The room was darker than he remembered. The windows were higher and smaller. As he watched, they shrank away, closing down to a pinhole and then vanishing entirely. The only light in the room came from his flashlight, and it was somehow no longer enough to illuminate the far side of the tiny space. Darkness stretched out all around Rene, engulfing him and his tiny cone of light. In panic, he turned his light to the floor, desperate to see anything. The wooden floorboards were still there, but instead of the regular, sensible lines, they now spread outward in complex, interlocking butterfly patterns. The patterns continued on past the edge of his light, 50 feet or more. The walls were gone. The stove was gone. Rene stood alone in a barren desert of wood, trembling. He told himself that it was impossible, a hallucination. He closed his eyes, reached outward with his hand, and walked slowly toward the back wall. He took 2 steps, 3, 4, and reached nothing. When he opened his eyes, he was still alone in that wooden desert, intricate butterflies under his feet. Far away, Rene could hear a quiet clattering. He trained the light in the direction the sound was coming from, but could see nothing. After a moment, he began walking toward the noise. He recognized that it might be a poor idea, but nothing else was coming to mind as a valid option right now. He walked for several minutes, the clattering growing steadily louder as he approached. Other sounds became clear in the background as well. The quiet creak and groan of hinges, the whispering of wood being drawn across other wood. The sound broadened, seeming to come from everywhere in front of him. Rene wondered if he was heading towards some manner of forest, if what he was hearing was branches rustling. He could feel no wind, though. A part of his brain screamed that this was crazy, that he was inside a small house, that none of this could be happening. Renee carefully closed that part away. If he paid too much attention to those thoughts, he knew he would start to panic. This was insane, but it was better not to think too much about it right now. Later, he could assess this. For now, simply reacting was best. Something glimmered at the edge of the light. Something moving. The clattering was everywhere now, a continuous roar. Renee moved cautiously forward until he could fully see what was before him. But although his light illuminated it, his mind refused to believe. Stretching out in either direction was an ocean of cabinets and drawers. Wooden doors lifted and fell in gentle waves, clacking and clattering as they went. Renee continued walking, unable to comprehend what he was looking at. There was no end he could see, millions of hinges moving millions of panels, nothing but cabinetry forever. Renee reached down and gently touched the lid of the cabinet in front of him. It pushed against his hand, raised by the ones pressed up against it. Renee could not see what caused their movement. Something out in that impossible ocean must be the source, but whatever it was lay far beyond his light. He stared at the cabinet sea for several minutes. His brain refused to generate any coherent sense. The doors rose and fell, clattering and whispering. The thought that finally jarred him back into action was humorously prosaic. It occurred to him that the GoPro had been taking essentially the same photo every minute that he'd been standing there. Somehow, this was what he needed to restore mobility to his limbs, to restart his mind. Whatever the way out of here was, it wasn't across that sea, at least not on foot. Renee turned his back on it and traveled back the way he'd come, hoping to find something more reasonable in the other direction. He walked for an indeterminate amount of time. The clacking of the ocean faded behind him, and for a while there was nothing but the sound of his own footsteps. The butterflies beneath him were unvaried and seemingly infinite. Renee began to wonder if there was any end to this at all. Finally, something broke the unending sameness of the paneled desert. A structure rose up before him, a towering ziggurat constructed from wooden beams. It reached high into the sky, and as Renee craned his neck up, he realized that there was indeed a sky up there. Faint light filtered down from somewhere, too little to see by yet, but enough to give hope that he was making progress, that he would not be trapped in infinite darkness when his flashlight gave out. As Renee drew even with the massive tower, he realized that it was made of door frames stacked together, each one sized for a normal house and all of them alike. He pushed on one tentatively, ready to run in case of collapse, but it appeared firmly rooted to the ground. He reached up and pulled on the header, lifting himself off of the ground and swinging briefly before releasing. He looked speculatively upward, fighting a strange desire to climb it. It looked fairly simple, with wide footing and solid places to grip. Maybe at the top he could see more of what was around him. Or maybe you could fall to your death. The sane part of his mind whispered. Renee clamped down on it once more, still unwilling to let it resume control. But he did skirt around the ziggurat, superstitiously refraining from passing through any of its myriad door frames. The blackness around Renee relaxed into a deep gloom. He could not make out the light source, but he began to see shapes ahead of him. Tall, oblong stripes, darker than the areas around them. They stood silent and still, unbothered by the interloper coming toward them. When he was close enough to catch them in the beam of his flashlight, Renee saw that they were trees of a sort. They were mahogany, but their trunks were smooth and polished, their bases carved with intricate scrollwork. The branches spreading out high over his head were equally detailed, and the leaves growing from the trees were thick and carved of the same dark wood as the rest of it. They were utterly motionless, and strain his ears though he might, Rene could detect no sound. Darkness descended again as he entered the carved forest. The interlocking leaves blocked out the little light that had filtered down. The sound of his footsteps echoed back at him from strange angles, giving the impression that others walked with him, close by, but unseen. They never drew closer, though, and whenever Rene stopped, the echoed footsteps stopped immediately after. There was a strange beauty to the dark forest. Rene turned off his flashlight, closed his eyes, and let himself walk forward by feel. The thick trunks slipped by under his hands, cool and marble smooth. He moved gently from one tree to the next, oddly calmed by the touch of the trees. Suddenly, there was no next tree ahead of him. He opened his eyes and was surprised to find it bright enough to see by. Still clearly night, but now navigatable without the flashlight. He could make out the landscape ahead, rising into hills that went on for what seemed to be miles. The forest stood behind him, a bulwark against the rising land. A few dozen feet ahead, set into the wooden floor, were a series of dark rectangles, a patterned line continuing as far as he could see. Rene approached curiously. The rectangles were door frames again, horizontal this time, each one lined with the edge of a pit that stretched down past where he could see. There were handholds carved into the walls of each pit, a rough ladder that suggested they led somewhere that was intended to be reached. Rene hesitated, looking at the empty, yawning door frames before stepping carefully along the floor between two of them and continuing on through whatever the house had become. The wooden floor gave way to textured ground, a field of tightly woven green fabric. It brushed up against Rene's calves as he walked, silencing his footsteps and replacing them with a soft, continuous shushing. An enormous moon hung off to one side, trapped in the square of a titanic window set into a spotted, yellowed cliff. Its glow was what illuminated the land around him. As Rene walked, orange ridges began to show beneath the strands of green fabric. They grew more frequent, gathering together and rising higher and higher until the green was far below him and he was clambering up a steep orange hill. The incline was intense, but the ridges kept his footing secure. Rene tucked his flashlight into his back pocket to allow him to grip with his hands as he climbed, and he made swift progress. At some point, he felt the flashlight slip from his pocket. He turned and made a grab for it, but it was tumbling away, bouncing and rolling back down the hill he had spent so much effort ascending. He watched it go, then looked to the crest of the hill. It was close, beckoning him, and the room was bright. He climbed onward. The crest of the hill butted up against the yellowed cliff. It was pitted and decayed, offering plenty of options to climb. The window containing the moon was not so far above, all things considered. He could reach it if he tried. And then what? His sanity asked. You can't escape through the glass. He had not been thinking about escape. He had been thinking about sitting on the sill and basking in the moon. He had been thinking about diving from the edge and knowing that the orange hill hundreds of feet below would catch him safely, that he was not meant to be hurt in this place. You'll die, his mind insisted, and reluctantly, Rene agreed that he had no reason to believe that he would not. Tearing his gaze from the cliff, he looked ahead, down the far side of the hill. The descent looked to be as steep as the way up had been. Beyond it, the green fabric fields resumed briefly, before fading away into some sort of terrain made of smoothed lumps. And beyond that, far beyond, was another cliff. The moonlight barely reached it. It seemed to have an odd geometric texture, but Rene could not make out the details from where he was. The only way to find out, he thought, was to go forward. His first steps down the hill were slow and cautious. The angle was perilous, the footing uncertain. He turned around and began to back down, using his hands to stabilize himself. But it was slow and arduous work. After a few minutes, he sat down to catch his breath. The first slide was accidental, a small slip. He caught himself before he had gone more than a few feet. As he steadied himself, though, he looked at the slope ahead of him and considered the distance. Sliding would be so much easier. If he was careful, he would surely be able to control it. He slid again, braking with his hands, going 20 feet or more. He stopped only to confirm that he could, then released his grip and allowed gravity to pull him along once more. Down he went, faster and faster. The friction heated up the seat of his pants, and he laid down on his back to distribute the heat. He was afraid that if he tried to stop himself, he would sear the skin from his hands. And so, he continued his pell-mell plunge down the hill. He crashed into the fabric fibers at the bottom, rolling over and over until he came to a stop dozens of feet away, dizzy and exhilarated. He stood slowly and waited with his hands on his knees for the world to stop spinning before straightening up completely. Ahead of him stood a single wooden door frame. It was not connected to anything. Rene could have easily walked around had he so chosen. Instead, he stepped boldly through, his sights set on the distant blocky cliff. The lumpen ground he had seen from the top of the hill was made of a smooth tan leather, soft and well-worn. It rose and fell in small hummocks and was studded with tunnels, some no bigger than his arm, some large enough to walk inside. Rene peered inside one and called out. The distant echoes suggested caverns below of great depth and complexity. The cliff, his mind insisted, and Rene pressed onward, walking steadfastly past the tunnels. As he reached the base, Rene saw at last what gave the cliff its blocky shape. It was made of doors, countless identical doors set haphazardly together, stretching upward in a cyclopean nightmare. He rattled the closest knob, but it was firmly locked, as were the ones on either side. One of these has to lead out, insisted his sanity. One has to be real. And at last, Rene let that part of his mind out. Let it gibber and roil and insist that this was wrong, that this was fake, that this was not how reality worked. He watched it with a detached sense of wonder, like watching a strange animal through the glass walls of a zoo. It was interesting, but it was not relevant. And it was certainly not him. Rene reached up, seizing hold of the top of a door frame. He stepped lightly onto a doorknob and hoisted himself up. He climbed, following a pattern that was perfectly clear, although he could not possibly have explained it. One door was right. That was all. One door led out. With certainty and direction, Rene moved quickly and easily up the vertical surface, stepping from knob to knob with the grace of a mountain goat. Some doors swung open, and he used them to maneuver sideways, heading toward his goal. He did not look to see where they went. He knew they were not his. Finally, he reached a door that, when it opened, revealed a moonlit porch and a city beyond it. The sky was touched with gray, but the street was empty and the surrounding areas still asleep. Rene looked at the porch where he had been drinking with his friends only hours before. It seemed unfamiliar, alien. The idea of even setting foot on it was unpleasant. He removed the GoPro from his forehead and hung it carefully from the knob, then closed the door. It latched with a sense of finality. Rene dropped swiftly down the cliff, his hands and feet finding holds without conscious thought. His mind was on the windowsill high above the orange hill. If he hurried, there would still be time to sit beneath the face of the moon. His friends returned well after dawn, laughing and joking. They were surprised not to see Rene waiting for them on the porch. "Maybe the ghosts got him after all," one offered. But the laughter at that comment died out when they saw the GoPro hanging from the doorknob. They searched the house from front porch to back, but it was empty. They called his phone and checked his house, but it was nowhere to be found. Finally, they downloaded the pictures from the GoPro, hoping it would provide some answers. What they saw was nightmarish, impossible. The sea of cabinetry, the dour mahogany forest, the threatening leather landscape. It shook every one of them, rattling a core belief that they had not understood they held. They deleted the photos and never spoke of them again. Renee was never found. The Fontenot house still stands.
I'm sure you've heard of the Ronald McDonald House charity. They provide housing for families of sick kids when they're in the hospital. Seems pretty innocent, right? Well, there's another side to the charity. There's another type of Ronald McDonald House, one that not many people know about. There's one in most big cities. You won't find it by looking for it. It doesn't have an address. It doesn't have a sign above the door. It doesn't even have windows. No. The only way you'll find it is if you're taken there. That's how I found it. I never met my real parents. I've been in and out of foster families and group homes here in Detroit since I was a kid. I'm 15 now, and I'm what they refer to as a bad kid. Always causing trouble, always getting thrown out and placed with another unsuspecting do-gooder who thinks they can help me. I always prove them wrong. My caseworker sat across the black metal table, looking wary and frazzled. On the table between us was a thick, letter-sized brown envelope, my case file. "Well, your reputation has preceded you," she said, "and now you only have two options: military school in Lansing, or the Ronald McDonald House, which has miraculously cleared you for acceptance. I don't have the patience for drill sergeants and 5 a.m. reveille. And how bad could a halfway house named after a fast food clown possibly be? The Ronald McDonald House it was. Dark clouds loomed above me the day I climbed into the back of my caseworker's town car. My few belongings in a backpack and the clothes on my back, that was all I could take. One of the few belongings I had was a photo album filled with pictures of all the foster families with whom I had previously been placed. It was nice to remember some of them, even though I had royally messed it up each time. I've had a few cases who went through the Ronald McDonald House, the caseworker said from the front seat. Things went so well for those kids, I never had to transfer them anywhere else. In fact, the house took over their case files and everything. We drove into downtown Detroit, past all the familiar landmarks. I had been thrown out of one foster home just outside town because I snuck into downtown Detroit with some neighbor kids to sneak into a dive bar. Good times. Well, here we are. The car came to a stop. I looked out the window. We had parked in front of a tall, gray, windowless building sandwiched between two other industrial buildings on a narrow city street. I noticed there was an address on the building to my left, as well as on the one to my right, but none on this particular building. Not even a sign. "Are you sure?" I asked, hesitating as I opened the car door and climbed out of the back seat. I slung my backpack over my shoulder, clinging tightly to the strap, and followed the caseworker up to the windowless metal doors. She pressed a buzzer and spoke to someone inside, and the doors clicked to unlock. We walked in. As soon as the metal doors closed behind us, I noticed the pin-drop silence. It was that sort of silence that is so oppressive and empty it is almost deafening. Across the dimly lit lobby, there was a glass window, with a woman sitting at a desk behind it, a secretary. Her back was to us, and she appeared to be typing intently. We walked over to the window. The caseworker rang a bell on the counter, and the secretary spun around in her chair. Her face was painted like a clown. Like Ronald McDonald, in fact. She even had the short, curly red hair. Aside from that, she appeared somewhat normal, adorned in a typical white nurse's dress. I wanted to laugh at how bizarre it was, but I couldn't. A chill swept down my spine. Something was not right. I watched as the nurse and my caseworker interacted. Paperwork was passed through the window. The caseworker slid my case file under the glass, and the nurse in turn slid her some papers to sign. As my caseworker signed the papers, the nurse looked at me. Her smile should have been warm and welcoming, but all I saw in her eyes was hunger. "I can't stay here," I stammered loudly. "Take me to the military school in Lansing. Please." "What's the matter, sweetie?" the nurse asked, her voice muffled slightly by the glass. "Afraid of clowns?" I looked into her hungry eyes. Now there was a malicious glint as she laughed. My caseworker laughed too, seemingly oblivious, and said, Now, don't overreact. You'd hate the military school. Besides, this'll be good for you." "Yes," said the clown nurse. "This will be good for you." Before I could object, I heard a slam behind me. I spun around to see an open door in the far corner of the lobby, to the left of the front desk window. There was no one there, just the light that flooded in from the door. Then creeping shadows appeared and seemed to grow along the wall, and shrill laughter suddenly echoed in the halls just outside the door. "Oh," said the caseworker, "here comes the welcome committee." As I stared in horror, clutching the strap of my backpack, my caseworker patted me on the shoulder for the last time. "Don't worry, honey. It'll be different this time. You'll feel right at home here, I promise." She turned to leave. I felt my stomach churning. Bile rose in my throat. "No!" I cried desperately. "You can't leave me here." "Oh, no, I've got to get going. I never did like clowns." And with that, she left me there. The metal door slammed behind her, and I was alone. I faced the open doorway by the front desk again. The shadows had nearly entered the room, and the piercing laughter was filling the lobby with sound. I ran to the front doors. I pounded and yanked and pushed and screamed. Screamed for help. Screamed for my caseworker. Screamed for anyone. Please, God. I turned to see the nurse behind the glass smiling at me again. And then they entered, laughing all the while. A whole group of laughing nurses with clown faces and red hair. Some were male, some female, but all wearing the same terrifying Ronald McDonald makeup. And in the dim light of the lobby, I could see the glint of metal tools in their hand. Bringing up the rear was a pair of clown nurses rolling a metal table, complete with restraints. Get away from me! I screamed. I pounded on the metal doors again. Let me out of here! They surrounded me, grabbing me as I thrashed and screamed and tried to tear myself away, laughing as I kicked and squirmed. They slammed me onto the rolling table and strapped me down. I looked around wildly. I was surrounded. Let me go! I screamed, twisting and turning and pulling at the restraints in vain. They rolled me through the open doorway and down a seemingly endless white hallway. All the while, they laughed and laughed and laughed. They waved their shiny scalpels and razors and needles mere inches from my face, just to make me flinch and scream, which I did. This made them laugh even harder. The last thing I remember, before one of them finally injected me, was the hands. Gloved fingers prodding inside my mouth and pulling at the sides of my cheeks, distorting my screams and forcing an unnatural grin onto my tear-streaked, sweaty face. Hot, rancid breath in my face, and the perverted voice whispering the suddenly ominous words. We love to see you smile. Then, as the maniacal laughter seemed to warp and slow like a dying record player, everything faded to black. I opened my eyes and found myself blinded by bright lights above. Shielding my groggy eyes from the fluorescent bulbs, I turned on my side and looked around. A cell. I was in a cell. Tall white walls covered in scratch marks and stains. A small drain in the corner of the floor. My toilet, perhaps. A door with no windows. And on the floor by the door, my backpack. I tried to sit up. My body ached, and the moment I sat upright, a sensation like vertigo overtook me. I wondered what they had drugged me with. I realized I was shivering. I looked down. I wasn't wearing my own clothes anymore. Instead, I was dressed in a dirty, ripped hospital gown, bright yellow, with a pattern of Ronald McDonald heads all over, nothing underneath. I heard faint sounds from somewhere in the building. They sounded like muffled screams. I tried to stand, but couldn't keep my balance. My vision was beginning to stabilize, but my body still felt like rubber. I sank to my knees and crawled over to my backpack. Before I got there, I tried to open the door. As expected, it was locked. I slumped onto the floor beside my backpack and unzipped it. All that remained inside was the photo album. They had taken my notebooks and pens and my cell phone. Of course they had. Warily, I opened the photo album. But instead of the photos that had been in there, photos of myself with my previous foster families, photos where I had attempted to look happy and hopeful, even though I knew I wouldn't be there for long. Instead of those photos, there was an array of amateur crime scene photos. And in each one, I recognized one of my former foster families, brutally murdered and covered in blood. My heart raced and my stomach churned. I began to turn the pages quicker. On each page, a new photo, a new family, new carnage. I recognized their faces and the insides of their homes. I had lived with all these people, and now they were all dead. I came to the last few pages. a photo of a house at night, then a window of that house, then inside the house, a dark hallway with light coming from one doorway. Then, a photo of my caseworker, brushing her teeth at her bathroom mirror. Then a photo of her looking at the camera in horror. Then a photo of the caseworker, naked, covered in her own blood, contorted into an unnatural position in her bathtub. I turned to the last page. Written inside the back cover of the photo album were 3 words. You never existed. Again, I tasted bile in the back of my throat. I threw the book to the ground, crawled over to the hole in the floor, and vomited. They were right. Having killed everyone who ever knew me, it was as though I had never existed. I heard more faint screaming in the distance. I knew I had to get out. I wiped the vomit off my face with my hospital gown and crawled back over to my backpack. Hopefully they hadn't found my secret weapon. I unzipped the front pocket and reached down into the very bottom, my fingers scraping the fabric. Sure enough, there they were, flush with the seams in the bag, nearly undetectable. The pins I used for picking locks. I told you, I'm a bad kid. I leaned against the door and listened. I could hear footsteps approaching, but no sooner had I detected them than they faded in the other direction. I knew I had to work fast. I jiggled the handle with one hand and picked the lock with the other hand. It was surprisingly simple. Holding the handle, I slowly pulled myself to my feet. I could maintain my balance now. I pulled the door open just a crack. A clown nurse darted past. My heart almost stopped. But his footsteps didn't slow or change, and soon faded. He didn't notice me. I poked my head out the door. Another seemingly endless white hallway lay before me, extending to infinity in either direction. The distant screams were louder now, coming from all around. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind me. I decided to go to the right, passing doors identical to the door I had been behind moments before. I heard screams and sobbing coming from behind each one. I stopped for a moment at one door. I heard the cry of a child inside. I jiggled the handle to see if I could let him out. Locked. I kept moving, looking behind me every few seconds to make sure no nurses had come into the hallway. Then I passed a set of white double doors. I stopped for a moment. The word "Play Place" was written in tall, thin letters across the width of both doors. I heard more screaming coming from within, the screams of multiple people, and laughter. The insane shrill laughter of the clown nurses. I shuddered. I was afraid to find out what sort of torture was happening inside, and I knew I had to keep moving. I saw a door ahead with a stairway symbol. I headed for it. As I opened the door, I glanced behind me and saw 2 clown nurses emerging from the play place room. Their white nurses' outfits were covered in streaks of blood. I quickly shut myself into the stairwell, hoping they hadn't noticed me. The stairwell was dimly lit, with cement walls and rusty railings. I looked behind at the door I had just closed. There was a red number 5 on it, so I figured I must be on the 5th floor. I decided to head for the ground level. Each of my footsteps echoed as I began to descend the stairs. I couldn't hear the screaming anymore, just a low, deep humming sound, like pipes in the walls. It was a welcome respite. I finally came to the door numbered 1. The staircase seemed to descend a few floors lower, but I stopped there and slowly peeked through the door. More white hallways. No clown nurses to be seen. So far, so good. I stepped through the door and walked into the hallway. I noticed I couldn't hear any screaming on this floor, just the buzz of the fluorescent tube lights above. I came to the end of the hallway and another set of double doors. A large red cross, the kind you'd see on a lifeguard's stand or a first aid kit, was painted across the width of them. I pressed my ear to the door. All I heard was a slow, rhythmic pulse, like a machine in motion, and a faint beeping sound, not unlike a monitor you might hear in a hospital room. I knew I shouldn't open the door. I knew this wasn't the exit, that I should keep looking. But I had to see. I turned the handle. It wasn't locked. I peeked inside. I found myself staring at a cavernous white room. Fluorescent lights flickered and buzzed. I saw wires hanging everywhere. And, hanging from the ceiling, in rows, kids. Kids in hospital gowns like mine, attached to white wooden crosses affixed to the ceiling, literally crucified. They were silent. Their heads drooped forward, their eyes either closed or staring at nothing. Some seemed to twitch a bit, but most were still. Their crosses swung back and forth very slightly, and the hanging wires. Upon closer inspection, they weren't wires at all. They were intravenous tubes attached to the kids' wrists. Tubes sucking out their blood. I almost vomited again right then and there. In the very center of the room, amidst the rows of hanging crosses, I could see where the rhythmic pulsing sound came from. A huge steel cylinder, which seemed to be collecting blood from all the tangled tubes that dangled from the kids' wrists. I opened my mouth involuntarily, to scream or to cry out in anger. I had no idea which. In the end, all I could manage to do was stammer and dry heave. That's when the alarms began to sound. Loud and piercing, like the police sirens of hell. The staff must have realized I was missing. I shut the doors and frantically glanced around the hallway to see if anyone was coming. No one yet. I ran for the stairwell. As soon as I entered the stairwell, I heard laughter from above, echoing and reverberating in the confined space. The clown nurses were coming. I stumbled down the stairs as fast as I could. I must have gone down another 3 stories before I reached the basement. I found myself running through a dark, sewer-like hallway with small light bulbs overhead every 10 yards or so. The smell of decay and rotting flesh grew more and more pungent as I ran. The laughter continued behind me. I managed a quick, furtive glance backwards and saw a group of them running after me. I saw them come into the light and then become silhouettes again. The sight of their smiling faces and gleaming knives and needles pushing my adrenaline to the max. I ran past alcoves full of stacked, rotting corpses, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't think of anything but escape. I turned a corner and found myself facing the metal rungs of a ladder in the wall. I climbed until my head smacked the ceiling. Below me, the shadows and laughter grew closer. Their footsteps slowed. They were close, and they knew it. I pushed at the ceiling above me, heaving upward and panting and screaming. The clowns were below me, laughing and waving their scalpels. Something cut my leg. I screamed and pushed one last time. The ceiling gave way as a manhole cover slammed onto asphalt above. A circular opening. I climbed out and frantically pushed the manhole cover back over the hole, blocking out the laughter of the clown nurses below. I laid there on top of the manhole cover for a few minutes as I caught my breath. Rain fell, cool and soft on my skin, washing away the feeling of imminent peril. The turbulent night sky above was a welcome sight. I looked around. Abandoned buildings, broken glass. No lights, no cars, no signs of any life at all. A police siren somewhere in the distance. Then, silence. I climbed to my feet. Pain shot through my leg. I looked down and saw the cut on my ankle where a clown nurse had slashed me. Bastards. Limping as best I could, I started to walk. "Hello?" I called out. The only answer was the distant roll of thunder. "Somebody help me! Please!" My foot landed on something soft and mushy. I looked down. A newspaper. I peeled it off the wet asphalt. Most of the ink had faded, but I was able to make out the date. July 13th, 1992. I dropped it, an icy dread filling my stomach. I kept walking. "Can anyone hear me?" I screamed. "Please! Anyone! Please!" Words faded into delirious sobs. I stood still for a moment. The rain had soaked through my thin hospital gown. I shivered as the wind blew. Then, I saw a light in the distance. It was a big, yellow M in the sky, the golden arches. A McDonald's. Of course. I limped towards it. When I reached the restaurant, I saw that apart from the M, the rest of the building was completely dark. I walked cautiously toward the broken windows and looked in. Pitch black. I turned and surveyed the play place outdoor playground. 10-foot-tall structures of colored tubes for kids to crawl through. Sitting at one of the benches was a familiar figure. The Ronald McDonald statue. You know, the one where you could sit beside him and it looks like he's got his arm around your shoulders. Every kid has seen it. I shuddered at the sight. The doors were unlocked. I walked in, out of the rain. Silence. Darkness. I noticed that the decor wasn't like what you see nowadays in a modern McDonald's. It was vintage 1980s, with the white plastic booths and the red and yellow tiles. The wind seemed to whisper through the broken windows. I noticed something on the front counter. A black rectangle. I got closer. A laptop. A nearly new laptop. I let out a soft, maniacal laugh. I suddenly knew exactly what I was supposed to do. So I took the laptop outside, and sat beside the Ronald statue. I opened the laptop and began to write out this story. The rain is falling on the keys, but I don't care. There's nothing left to do now but wait. Because I've been noticing something out of the corner of my eye. Ronald is trying to look over my shoulder. He's laughing now. All I can do is join him.
Chilling tales for dark nights.